Welcome back to From the Depths of the Board. Tonight we're heading into the deep woods, guided by stories pulled straight from the anonymous pages of the 4chan Paranormal board. These are the stories that don't come with explanations, just fragments of experience, retold by those who stumbled into something they can't quite explain. Whether it's strange lights, forgotten graves, or unsettling encounters with things that shouldn't be there, each tale is a step deeper into the unknown. Settle in. Let the fire crackle low, and listen closely, because once you're out there, far from the road, past the last trail marker, you never really know what's watching you from the trees. Story 1. The Watching Fire Pit. I was hunting in northern Texas. It was my second night out, and I was sitting by the campfire, drinking coffee and just soaking in the quiet. But then I got that feeling, like I was being watched. You know the one, that slow creeping unease that wraps around you even though nothing's changed. It got under my skin enough that I stayed up most of the night, sitting there with my gun across my lap, just staring into the trees. The next morning I decided to have a look around. I found a couple of broken twigs in the brush, but nothing that really pointed to anything solid. Still, I kept moving, climbing up this ridge, hoping maybe I'd stumble on something that would explain that feeling, and I did. At the top, I came across something strange. Right there in the middle of nowhere was a fire pit. The embers were still glowing red, like whoever had been there had only just left. Around the fire pit were these symbols, some kind of strange spiraling designs. It looked like something out of a weird hippie ritual, or maybe something darker. I didn't stick around to figure it out. I took a few pictures, turned around and got out of there fast. That place didn't feel right. Something about it still gives me chills. Story 2. The Clearwater Canyon Encounter. It was last year when me and a few buddies decided to take our snowmobiles up near Mount St. Helens. The area had just gotten 3 feet of fresh snow, and we figured it was a good chance to go for an evening ride. When we got there, it was clear no one else had been up that way. No tracks, no snowshoers, nothing. Just pristine snow and silent woods. The area we were headed toward was near Clearwater Canyon off the 25 road. We took off, riding all the side roads, just cruising and having fun in the moonlight. After a couple hours, we stopped back at the truck for some food. The sky was bright, the moon was full, and everything felt calm. So we figured, why not go for one more night ride before calling it? It was pushing about 8:30 p.m. when we went back up the 25. That's when we saw the lights. Down in the canyon, lights flickered, brief flashes turning on and off. At first we thought it might be people down there, maybe someone working on something. But the thing is, there's no easy way into that canyon. No roads, no trails. It's about a 3-mile hike in, minimum. There's no public access. No reason anyone should be down there, especially not at night in that kind of snow. We stopped and watched for a while, trying to figure it out. The lights didn't move like headlights or flashlights. They looked like industrial lights. Maybe something mechanical was going on, but none of it made sense. We were spooked, no doubt, and decided to call it a night. I was on the lead snowmobile, and as we started heading back, we didn't realize that Chad had gotten stuck behind us. It wasn't until we got back to the truck that we noticed he hadn't made it back yet. When he finally pulled in, something was different. Chad was pale, shaking, and wide-eyed. I've known him since we were kids, and I've never seen him look like that before. He jumped off his snowmobile, yelling that we needed to get out of there right now. He said something had come out of the canyon, a bright light, brighter than anything he'd ever seen, and it was moving toward him on foot. At first we thought he was exaggerating, maybe just shaken up from being alone in the dark. But he swore up and down it was real. Whatever it wasn't a vehicle. It was a person or something that looked like one. It walked up out of the canyon, through feet of snow, and was heading straight for him with that light shining right into his face. He said it was just 20 yards away when he finally got his snowmobile free and tore out of there. We tried to come up with a logical explanation, maybe some kind of secret military training exercise, but nothing fit. Who walks through 3 miles of snow-covered canyon at night, carrying an insanely bright light, heading directly towards someone? To this day, none of us have figured it out. And Chad, he still won't talk about it for long. He just says, there was something out there, and leaves it at that. Story 3. The Forgotten Graves and Visions. A few years ago, I was out hunting near McMinnville, when I stumbled across something unexpected. It wasn't an animal or some strange creature in the woods. What I found was 2 graves, just there, tucked away in the trees. Old, weathered and quiet. You could tell this place had once been part of something, a homestead, maybe. The graves had small plaques, the kind that someone clearly placed with care a long time ago, but now they were faded and barely maintained. One was a young man, the other, an infant. Both had died in 1909. That alone was enough to put a lump in my throat. But what really got to me was what happened next. I'm not someone who usually talks about this kind of thing, but as I stood there, I felt something. I could see it in my mind, like a memory that wasn't mine. A young woman, tears streaming down her face, burying her husband and her child just months apart. The weight of that sorrow was heavy. It wasn't just a thought. It felt real, like I was seeing her grief echoing through time. I don't know how to explain it, and I'm not one to get overly sentimental. But I knew then I'd come back, not for hunting, but to pay my respects. That spot deserves it. It's not hard to find, either. Just a half-mile off the gravel road, right by this massive orange-barked tree, maybe a yew. You can't miss it. That tree stands like a silent witness, towering above everything around it. You can see it from 500 yards away. Story 4. The Altar and the Wandering Naked Man. I've come across a lot of strange things out in the woods, but a few of them stick in your mind more than others. One time, deep in the Mount Hood National Forest, I was hiking about a mile off a popular trail when I found something off. It was a circle of medium-sized stones, arranged in a clear symbol, an old-style pentagram. It was laid out perfectly in front of a flat-topped boulder at the base of a rock wall. The placement wasn't random. Someone had taken their time setting this up. It looked like some kind of altar. The people I was with weren't having any of it. They were ready to leave the second they saw it, but I couldn't just walk away. So I stayed a moment longer, and half-jokingly, rearranged the rocks into a smiley face before we left. I'm not sure it helped the mood much, but it felt like the right thing to do. That wasn't the end of it though. Later on, I was walking along the lower Sandy River, just enjoying the quiet. And then I saw something that still sticks in my head. A large, completely unclothed man was sitting in the sand, playing with the dirt, and talking gibberish to himself. I didn't even see him until I was practically on top of him. We locked eyes for a second, but I didn't stop. I just kept walking, pretending like I hadn't seen a thing. Didn't even change my pace. I don't know what he was doing, or why he was there, but it was unsettling in a way that's hard to explain. Not threatening, just wrong somehow. That kind of encounter isn't easy to forget. And then there's the shoes. I've noticed it more times than I can count. Pairs of shoes left in the middle of nowhere. Perfectly normal shoes, just sitting out there in the woods, like someone walked out of them and vanished. No trails nearby, no camps, just shoes. And every time, I wonder how in the world do people manage to lose their shoes out here? No answers, just weirdness, every time. Story 5. The Body in the River. It was sometime in the mid-80s, early one August morning. A buddy and I were headed up the Clackamas River, looking for elk. We were driving along in his truck, cruising around 65 miles an hour. I was sitting in the passenger seat, just staring out at the river, when I saw something that made me jolt upright. There was a body in the water. I told him to stop. Of course he didn't believe me at first, thought I was joking or seeing things. But he pulled over and backed up to the spot I'd seen it. We walked along the guardrail, trying to find the exact spot again. The glare off the water was strong, but once we got to the right angle, it was unmistakable. A man was floating face down in about 8 feet of water. He was wearing hip waders and a fishing vest, completely motionless under the surface. There were 2 guys fishing off the rocks on the riverbank nearby, so we told them what we saw and suggested they might be in for more than they bargained for if they cast their lines near that spot. We were going to head back to Estacada to call it in, but before we could even leave, a county cop came racing up the road. We flagged him down and told him everything. Turns out, he was already responding to a flipped drift boat upstream, about half a mile from where we were. 2 men had gone out earlier that morning. They hit a rock, flipped their boat, and both of them ended up in the river. One managed to swim to shore. The other didn't make it. The one we saw, he never took off his hip boots. He also had a heavy fishing vest, probably weighed down with lead. It was a tragic thing to see, but it helped the authorities piece together what happened that morning. A reminder that sometimes nature doesn't need anything paranormal to remind you how thin the line is out there between safety and something else entirely. Story 6. The Lucky Lost Watch. About 5 years ago, I was out elk hunting in eastern Oregon. There was about 8 inches of snow on the ground, and we'd just wrapped up our final day. As we got back to the truck around dusk, I took off my outer coat, packed up and headed for camp. It wasn't until we got there that I realized my watch was gone. I figured it must have slipped off when I took my coat off. I wasn't too torn up about it. It was a cheap watch, nothing fancy. I'd had it for 5 or 6 years already. I didn't see the point in driving all the way back to look for it, so I just let it go and moved on. Fast forward a year later, same general area, only this time we were back for deer season. As I was walking through the brush, close to where we'd parked the year before, I figured, what the heck, might as well take a look around and see if there was any trace of the old watch. I wasn't expecting anything. Maybe at best, I could find the metal Twisto Flex band. It was still in good shape and worth keeping. And then I saw it. There it was, lying right in the tall grass, same spot where I must have dropped it the year before. But here's the kicker. The thing was still running, still ticking, still showing the correct time, only off by a minute or 2. It had survived a full year out there, through snow, rain, sun, and who knows what else. That little watch took a beating, and kept going. It wasn't even one of those name-brand tough watches, it just kept working. I still use that band to this day. I guess you could call it lucky now. Story 7. The Hobo Camp Legends. There's a place out near where I live that always gave me the creeps. People call it a hobo camp. But that doesn't really do it justice. It's deeper in the woods, off the beaten path, and if you believe the stories, it's not just a camp, it's a place where strange things happen. I've never gone too far into it myself. Honestly, the rumors alone are enough to keep most people away. Some folks say there are old rundown shacks out there, covered in bizarre graffiti, satanic symbols, strange markings, the kind of stuff that doesn't feel like harmless vandalism. It feels intentional. One story that always stuck with me was about a girl from the local cross-country team. Her route took her down a trail that passed close to the edge of that forest. One day she came sprinting out, pale and terrified. Said she'd been chased by someone. Some drifter or hobo who had come out of the trees carrying a butcher knife. Now, maybe it was just a twisted prank. Maybe it was some wild misunderstanding. But the stories didn't stop there. Some folks say the camp is more than just a hangout spot. That there's some kind of ritual activity going on. Weird gatherings, symbols carved into trees, old furniture burned in strange patterns. The kind of stuff that feels just a little too organized to be random. Of course, not every story is terrifying. One time, a group of us were out in the woods just chilling, when a hobo actually came by. Totally different vibe. He was calm, kind even. We gave him a beer, and he ended up telling us his whole life story. No begging, no weird behavior. Just a man with a rough past and nowhere to go. After a while he just walked off, didn't ask for anything more. But that's the thing about the legends. They don't paint a clear picture. Some people say the place is cursed. Others say it's just misunderstood. But I'll tell you this, even the calmest woods can hide something strange. And sometimes the stories are just true enough to make you stay away. Story 8. The Vietnam War bunker in the woods. I was in my early 20s, out hunting in some thick, old-growth forest. It was one of those calm, slightly foggy days, quiet, a little too quiet. I was walking through the trees when I noticed an opening I'd never seen before. A circular clearing, like the size of a baseball infield, tucked away from the main trails. In the middle of it was a large tarp and an empty flagpole. At first I thought maybe it was some kind of hidden meeting spot. Maybe even something sinister. KK rallies, strange cult stuff. You hear about those things happening in secluded places, and my instincts were immediately on edge. I kept my distance and scanned the area through my binoculars. That's when I noticed the details. Piles of razor wire with old beer cans strung along it, forming a makeshift perimeter fence. A large shield-shaped sign with military insignia, something like Navajo, 2nd Cavalry Division, painted with a horse's head and a sword. It looked like someone had recreated a base, like a memory frozen in time. Around the perimeter were small underground bunkers. You could barely see the roofs, but they had firing slits and were spaced evenly like a defensive ring. It didn't feel like an old installation. It felt active, maintained, purposeful. Then I heard it shouting. Voices, and dogs. I froze. I couldn't see anyone, but the barking was getting louder. 2 dogs came running through the clearing, heading straight toward where I had been standing. One was a pit bull, the other just as large. I slowly backed into the trees and watched as they stopped, sniffing the air exactly where I'd just been. I was ready to defend myself if I had to. But thankfully they didn't pick up my trail. I managed to slip away and get out of there without incident. Later I came back with 2 friends. Safety in numbers. We went past the perimeter and looked around. The place was surreal, like someone had spent years building this self-contained world, recreating a battlefield from their memories. Eventually, I found out it belonged to a Vietnam vet, a recluse who'd built the place as a way to relive or maybe process his past. No cult, no criminal activity, just a man, trying to remember a part of his life that never really left him. Still, to this day that place gives me the chills. Not because it was evil or haunted, but because it was so deeply human. A personal war zone, hidden in the woods, forgotten by the world. Story 9. The Peeing Arsonist and the Burning Trees. It was during a hunting trip in the Wallowas years back. Me and some buddies were out scouting an area, just cruising along a dirt road on our way to a spot we liked. We were coming around a bend when we saw something strange. A guy parked in the middle of the road, standing outside his truck, facing a tree that was on fire. It wasn't a campfire or a lightning strike or anything natural. It was just a single tree, covered in that dry, stringy moss you see in certain forests, and it was burning. The guy didn't even look at us. He just stood there, staring at the tree like it was the most normal thing in the world. And then he got back into his truck and calmly moved over so we could pass. We thought that was weird enough, until we reached our spot and realized it wasn't just one tree. There were several others in the area, all scorched or partially burned. The strangest part was that around each one, there was a ring in the snow, like the guy had relieved himself around the base before setting it alight. It was creepy, in a way that's hard to explain. Something about the deliberate nature of it, the repetition, the patterns, it just didn't sit right. The next day, a game warden showed up at our camp, just doing a routine check. We told him about the burning trees and the strange guy. He kind of chuckled at first and asked, "You sure he was just doing that?" We said yeah, we were pretty sure. Then things escalated. The following morning, a forest ranger came through, asking a lot more pointed questions. Turns out there had been reports of suspicious fires in the area before, and they were taking it seriously now. Apparently this wasn't the first time someone had spotted this same type of burning pattern. The snow had kept them from investigating it the previous season, but now they were ready to move fast. One of our guys showed the ranger the burn sites we'd seen, and he confirmed that some of the trees had been deliberately torched, some of them still alive. That was the detail that sealed it. They had something they could actually act on now. By the end of that day, we saw a whole caravan of green Forest Service trucks racing up into the hills. Looked like they were finally trying to catch the guy. We never heard how it ended, but I'll never forget how bizarre it was. Someone wandering the woods, lighting up trees in some ritualistic pattern, and marking them in his own unsettling way. It was like stumbling into the middle of someone else's obsession, or madness. Story 10. The Hoosier Forest Tree Marker. This one's short, but it stuck with me. I was deep in Hoosier National Forest, way off the beaten path, at least 30 miles from any real road. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. I was hiking along when something caught my eye up ahead. There was a tree, nothing unusual at first glance, just another tall, old tree among thousands. But then I noticed something pinned to the trunk. I got closer, and my stomach turned. It was a message. Something disturbing, the kind of thing you don't expect to see in a place like that. Just a piece of paper, pinned to the tree with a nail, flapping lightly in the breeze. I won't repeat what it said word for word here, but it wasn't welcoming. It was dark, cryptic, almost like a warning meant for anyone who stumbled upon it. And there was no sign of anyone else out there. No camps, no gear. Just that note, sitting in the middle of nowhere, as if it was meant to be found, or maybe meant to scare someone off. I took a picture and left. I didn't stick around to try and figure out who put it there, or why. Sometimes, the strangest things aren't the noises in the woods or the shadows behind trees. Sometimes, it's the things left behind. Story 11. The Alvord Desert Encounter. I had just quit my job and was about to start a new one, with a full week off in between. It felt like the perfect time to get away from everything. So I decided to go camping with my dad. We picked a place we'd never been before, southeastern Oregon, that final corner of the state we hadn't yet explored. We headed toward the Heart Mountain Antelope Refuge. Along the way we passed through Riley, then made our way south, bagged a couple of jackrabbits near Christmas Valley, and eventually made camp. The campground had a hot spring with a natural pool, one of those hidden gems still untouched by crowds. We were the only ones there. It was early in the year, the snow had just melted, and there was still plenty of it scattered around. That night after setting up, we climbed into the hot spring. It was silent, crystal clear skies overhead, stars everywhere. It felt like a moment out of time. Then we heard it, a jet roaring overhead. Maybe an F-15 or something like that. I looked up to catch a glimpse of it when suddenly a massive red light appeared, just hanging there directly in the jet's flight path. It wasn't a plane. It wasn't anything I could explain. The red light blinked into existence, and in the next second the jet made a sharp 90-degree turn. So sharp it was like the pilot was trying to get out of there fast. The light vanished just as suddenly as it had appeared. I stood up in the hot spring, heart racing. My dad hadn't even noticed it. By the time he looked up it was already gone. I tried to brush it off, told myself it must have been some kind of Top Gun moment. Maybe a missile test. Maybe a plane blew something out of the sky. A weird coincidence. I made up whatever story I needed to make myself feel okay. We slept well enough that night. Didn't think too hard about it after that. At least, not yet. The next morning we broke camp and headed toward the Alvord Desert, on the far side of Steens Mountain. We stopped in Lakeview for gas and propane, crossed briefly into California, then dipped into northern Nevada before looping back into Oregon. It was remote country, empty roads, no cell service, just miles of open space. We pulled into a tiny town called Fields, population 6, for more fuel and grabbed a burger. Inside the gas station, I noticed a picture hanging on the wall. A mountain lion, huge, apparently killed just the week before. The woman behind the counter noticed me staring and offered me a piece of smoked mountain lion. Her husband had shot it not far from there. That was my first taste of mountain lion. Fields, Oregon, interesting place. From there we drove north into the Alvord Desert, a vast, dry salt flat at 4,500 feet elevation, with Steens Mountain towering over the western edge. Between the desert and the mountain, we found another hot spring and stripped down to shorts. Someone else was already there. An old man, maybe 70 years old, deeply tanned, clearly a regular. He didn't get many visitors. He talked a lot, told us stories, shared bits of his life, said he'd lived alone on the edge of the desert for 10 years, ever since his wife passed. He seemed harmless, kind even. But when I mentioned our plans to camp up on Steens Mountain, his tone changed. He warned us, told us weird things happen up there, that it wasn't a place to camp, just flat out said we should avoid it. But of course we didn't listen. We left the gravel road and took a rugged dirt track up the mountain. After a slow, careful drive, we found a beautiful flat spot, best camp I'd ever seen. The mountain behind us, the whole desert spread out in front of us, another range far in the distance. Quiet, peaceful, warm for March. We set up camp and took the truck farther up the trail to explore. Spotted a herd of bighorn sheep, managed to get within 50 yards for photos. As night fell, we returned to camp and sat around a small fire, soaking in the silence. Off in the distance, down by the gravel road, we saw another vehicle pull in. It headed up the same trail we'd taken, stopped halfway up, and then cut its lights. I figured they were just setting up camp down there. A while later we saw another light, bright, almost bluish white, like HID headlights. At first I thought it was another car, but it was just a single light, not two. It was so bright it caught my dad's attention too. Then it started moving, fast, really fast. The trail up that mountain had taken us 20 minutes to climb. Whatever this was, it was covering that distance in seconds. It couldn't have been a car. It was completely silent. I thought maybe it was a helicopter, but there was no sound, not even a low hum, and we could hear everything up there, even tires on gravel from miles away. But this, nothing. My dad stood up. It saw our fire, he said. It's coming right at us. Put it out. We both jumped up. The light was almost on top of us now, completely silent, moving at an impossible speed. I looked straight up, and the light was no longer on the trail. It was above us in the air. Huge, blinding, and then gone. Just blinked out. No sound, no aftermath, nothing. We stood there in silence, trying to process what just happened. Later, when we finally crawled into our sleeping bags, the wind picked up. Out of nowhere, a storm rolled in. Violent, howling winds, clouds blotting out the stars. The tent started shaking, flapping hard. I was sure I wouldn't sleep a minute that night. But somehow, despite everything, I passed out. Then I woke up to screaming. My dad was yelling, the tent glowing orange. My heart exploded with panic. I'd taken off my glasses and couldn't see, but the glow was everywhere. I thought, this is it. The light came back. Turns out, it was just one of our folding camp chairs. The wind had knocked it into the fire, and it had started burning. My dad, half panicked, had rushed out to pull it away and burned his hand in the process. I was furious at first. After everything, that scare felt cruel. But looking at him, I could see it wasn't about the chair. We were both still shaken from what we'd seen earlier. Eventually we got back in our sleeping bags. The wind got worse. Some time later, I woke again, confused, suffocating. The tent had collapsed around me. A pole had broken, and was hitting me in the back of the head. I struggled to get out, and found my dad gathering gear in the corner. We bailed, got in the truck and sat in silence, while the wind battered the vehicle. Eventually I passed out again. When I woke it was still, calm, clear skies. The stars were out. My dad and I stepped out of the truck, walked over to the tent, and it was standing again. Somehow, with several broken poles, the wind had stopped, and the tent had popped back up, like nothing happened. We didn't speak, just crawled back in, and went to sleep. The next morning we packed up and left, fast. I had hoped the other campers we saw earlier were still down the trail, but they were gone. The light, whatever it was, had passed directly over where they were parked. I guess we weren't the only ones who'd had enough. To this day, I still don't know what we saw. That red light, the silent blue orb, the windstorm, the fear, it all still plays in my mind. My dad didn't even want to talk about it, for over a year. When he finally did, he just said he still couldn't explain it either. Later on, I searched online, and found stories. Others who'd camped in the Alvord Desert. Others who'd seen lights. Maybe that old man was right. Maybe weird things really do happen up there. Story 12. The Bigfoot Tracks in the Snow. It was during rifle season, 1978, or maybe 79. I was hunting elk with my uncle, up the middle fork of the Willamette River, just above Oak Ridge. There was about a foot of snow on the ground, and honestly the hunting had been pretty disappointing. We hadn't seen a single elk the whole trip. My uncle's buddy was also out hunting in the area, though he was camped a few miles down the road from us, near Indigo Springs. One evening, after dark, he pulled into our camp. He didn't even say hello, or ask how the hunt had been. He just looked at us and said, "I want you to come with me tomorrow. I've got something to show you." That was it. We didn't know what to expect, but curiosity got the better of us. The next morning we followed him out along the road, no idea where we were headed or what he was about to reveal. What he showed us stopped us in our tracks. Footprints, huge ones, clear as day, carved into the snow, walking in a line along the edge of the road. But what really got me, what really made my skin prickle, was where the tracks jumped from the raised shoulder, about 4 feet above the road surface, and landed straight out onto the road. It was a leap that no human could reasonably make, not in snow that deep, not without a running start or slipping. But the stride kept going, uninterrupted. We followed the prints across the road. They led to a fallen log, piled with snow. A normal person would have brushed the snow off climbing over it, but not these tracks. Whatever made them, had stepped over cleanly, without disturbing the snow that was stacked nearly 3.5 feet high on top of that log. That's what hit me the hardest. The effortless way it had moved. No dragging, no struggle, just a straight, powerful step over. We eventually went back to camp, grabbed my old 8mm film camera, and returned to document it. The footage wasn't perfect, cheap gear, bad lighting, but I got what I could. You can still see the tracks, the depth, the stride, the log, and that eerie jump from the embankment to the road. It's all on that old film reel, grainy and faded now, but still chilling to watch. I've seen all the documentaries, and heard all the skepticism. I get it. But I'm telling you, those tracks were exactly like the ones you hear described in other sightings. 16, maybe 18 inches long, with a gait and stride that was clearly not human. And after seeing the way they cleared that log without disturbing the snow, I don't know what else to say. I still don't know what made those tracks, but I've believed ever since that day, and I probably always will. Story 13. The van, the RV and the armed cabin. It started on a hunting trip deep into warehouse property. Me and my dad, way out in a section where most people never go. We were winding along an old dirt road, when we came around a bend and saw something that immediately made us uneasy. A van parked dead center in the middle of the road. 2 guys stepped out, long hair, smoke trailing behind them, waving at us to stop. My dad pulled up cautiously. They said their van had broken down. Nothing too strange on the surface, until we noticed a couple of women in the back, along with some small kids. Something about it just didn't sit right. We didn't have any jumper cables, but we gave one of the guys a ride back to town in the bed of our truck. As we drove, we had a strong hunch. They weren't just out for a casual drive. More likely, they'd broken down while hauling a little forest-grown harvest, if you catch my drift. That memory stuck with me. But it wasn't the only strange moment I had out in those woods. A few years earlier, I'd been driving down an old road off Highway 26. No one had used it in a while. The road straightened out ahead of me, and there, about 100 yards in, sat an old RV trash scattered around it. The whole place felt wrong. Gloomy, damp, and way too quiet. I got this heavy feeling, like I was being watched. I didn't stick around to find out. I turned around and got out of there fast. Years later, I passed by that road again. The RV was gone, but now there was an abandoned vehicle shoved off the side. Same creepy vibe. Same sense that someone, or something, didn't want company. And then there was another time, hunting in the Tiago unit. We were exploring another old road. These places always lead to something strange. Off the side of the road, we saw a wooden cabin someone had built. Not a cozy getaway. More like a place you'd expect trouble. The folks inside had guns, and they didn't look like the kind you'd want to share a campfire with. My buddy didn't hesitate. He slammed the truck into reverse, and we got out of there before anyone stepped outside. I've come across plenty of weird stuff in the woods. Burnt-out cars, old magazines, dirty remnants of whatever used to be out there. But it's these moments that stay with me. When the stillness feels heavy, when strangers show up in places they shouldn't, and when you realize the woods aren't always empty, even when they seem that way. Story 14. The Silent Supersonic Plane Encounter. This happened several years ago, probably around 1999 or 2000. I was scouting before archery elk season, up near the Nehalem River by Foss. It was getting close to dusk, and my buddy and I were up on a ridge near a landing, watching the sky start to turn. That's when we saw it. A plane moving faster than anything I've ever seen. No sound, no roar, not even the deep thrum you expect from a military jet. Just this sleek blur streaking across the sky, low and fast. It didn't look like any plane I'd ever seen. The contrail it left behind looked bizarre, like little rings of smoke on a rope. Donuts strung along a line. The underside of the thing reminded me of the space shuttle, but it was all white. And the silence, that's what really got me. Even after it passed, the only sound was a faint muffled hum. That plane was absolutely moving at supersonic speeds, probably faster, and yet it barely made a noise. Later on, I caught a documentary where people talked about spotting these secret planes near military bases. They even described that same donut-style contrail. Turns out the military sometimes tests their experimental aircraft over remote parts of Oregon, right along the coast where nobody's around to notice. If that's what we saw, then I get why they retired the old SR-71. Because whatever that thing was, it made our fastest planes look like toys. Story 15. The Hidden Hawaiian Graveyard. It was supposed to be just a scenic hike, something peaceful during a trip to Hawaii. My wife and I were exploring Waibio Valley. The road down into it drops 1,000 feet in just 1 mile. That's a 25% grade, and it keeps most people away. Once you're on the valley floor, it stretches wide and long, with sheer walls that rise over 1,000 feet on every side. There's no real village there anymore. Just a few taro farmers and the remnants of what once was a thriving community during King Kamehameha's time. But that all changed after a tsunami devastated the area. The king eventually declared that no one should live in the valley full-time again. Anyway, we followed a small stream upstream, deeper into the valley. The trail disappeared, so we found ourselves wading through water, clothes over our heads, climbing over rocks. After a couple hours, we ended up in a box canyon, narrow and closed on 3 sides by towering cliffs. A delicate waterfall misted into a deep aquamarine pool. The air felt different there, still, sacred, like we'd stepped into another world. That's when we noticed it. A raised bench of land, 30 feet higher than the rest. Something about the vegetation looked deliberate. We walked closer and realized what we were standing in. A graveyard. Rows and rows of tea leaf plants surrounded the area, but nestled among them were ancient graves, quiet markers from a forgotten time. There was no trash, no footprints, no signs of anyone having been there recently. Just that untouched spiritual presence. It wasn't the kind of story with fear or danger, but something about that place, its silence, its mystery still echoes in my memory. A hidden resting place, preserved by time and the land itself. And we had stumbled right into it, completely by accident. Story 16. The Satanic Ritual and the Cowish Canyon Militia. It started as a routine hunting trip, nothing unusual, nothing out of the ordinary. I was heading up into the mountains, to a place I'd been dozens of times before, somewhere above Nakas and Teton, where the canyons stretch out like veins through the hills. I pulled up to the same elk fence gate I'd gone through 100 times. Got out, opened it, but something felt off. A little twinge of unease in the back of my mind. I ignored it, got back in, pulled the truck through, then stepped out again to shut the gate. That feeling came back, stronger this time. I don't know what I was thinking, but instead of shaking it off, I decided to check out a small side trail just off the road. Maybe I was curious, maybe I just wanted to reassure myself that everything was fine. It wasn't. About 50 feet in, I found it. A massive pentagram, made out of stones, laid out on the ground. The center of it held the charred remains of a fire, still warm. Around it burnt down candles, their wax melted into the dirt, and hanging above it, strung from a tree, was a house cat, or what was left of one. It had been slit open from tail to chin, gutted, the inside spilling out like some kind of offering. The whole scene hit me like a punch to the stomach. I had to swallow back the urge to gag. I don't know what kind of people had been out there, but they had left in a hurry, probably not too long before I arrived. Something about it just made me furious. Maybe it was the gut feeling that I wasn't alone out there. Maybe it was the fact that whoever did this had walked away thinking they owned this place. So I cut the cat down and tossed it into the brush, kicked the rocks out of formation, scooped dirt over the fire pit until nothing was left but the cold. But the unease didn't leave with it. I told myself to shake it off and kept hunting. Probably not the smartest move, but that's what I did. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise outside the tent felt sharper, more deliberate, like something was watching. And that wasn't even the strangest thing that happened on that trip. Just south of where I had been, down in Cowish Canyon, things took another turn. That area had always been known for attracting odd folks, hermits, off-grid survivalists, and groups that weren't exactly the friendliest. I'd heard stories, but I'd never run into them myself. Not until now. We were driving down one of the logging roads that led into the canyon. From the rim you could see straight down into the valley, and right there in the middle of the road was a huge camp. But this wasn't just some hikers or a casual group of campers. We pulled out binoculars, at least 15, maybe 20 men, all in full camouflage, assault rifles strapped across their backs, and one of them right at the edge of the camp was looking straight back at us through his own binoculars. Then he lifted his hand, motioned for us to come down. I don't know what made us do it. Maybe the fact that he didn't look immediately hostile, maybe the curiosity, but we drove down into the valley, straight toward them. The man met us as we pulled up. He had a hard look, but he wasn't aggressive. The first thing he asked was whether we were law enforcement. We said no. His response? Good. We don't want them up here. And don't just sit up on the rim looking down at us. Makes us nervous. That's when it hit me. These guys weren't just out here for fun. They were living here, policing the area themselves. And they did not like being watched. The conversation didn't last long. He wasn't threatening, but we got the message. We left, took a different route out of the canyon, and didn't go back. Between the ritual site and the militia, that trip changed how I looked at those mountains. I used to think of them as open land, free to explore. But out there, past the roads, past the places where normal people go. There are others who call those woods home, and some of them don't want visitors. Story 17. The cult markers in the grizzly unit. It started with a single strange thing in the woods. I was out archery hunting in the grizzly unit, pushing through thick timber, when I stumbled across something odd. A marker, carefully constructed from brightly colored stones, arranged with precision. At first I thought it was just someone messing around, maybe another hunter passing the time. Then I found another one, and another. Within the next mile, I came across 24 of these strange little structures, and the deeper I went, the more uneasy I started to feel. They weren't just random rock piles. The green limbs woven into their centers were carefully whittled, tied together, almost like something you'd see in Native American handiwork. But the strangest part, between the outer stakes, strands of twine stretched between them, strung with hundreds of tiny ornaments. Each one was shaped like a ghost, fabric tied over something small, probably a nut or a seed. That's when it hit me. These weren't just decorations. They were deliberate, placed here by someone, scattered through the woods, as if marking something. I snapped a few pictures and called the Prineville Forest Service office when I got back to town. Turns out, they already knew about them. Apparently a few years back, they'd found similar structures and traced them to a group, a cult for lack of a better word. The group had told them the markers had been removed. But here I was, standing in the middle of the woods, surrounded by new ones. The Forest Service said they'd go back in a few weeks and clear them out again. But that wasn't the end of it. Months later, I was back in the same area. No snow on the ground, just a cold, empty stretch of woods. I wasn't even thinking about the markers anymore, until I spotted another one. Not far off the road, tucked in the same area. Like a quiet reminder that whoever put them there was still out there. I don't know what they meant. I don't know who made them. But whoever did, whoever went through the trouble of placing dozens of them through the trees, was serious about whatever they were doing. And I don't think they ever really left. Story 18. Lost in the snow and surrounded by forest creatures. It happened about 5 years ago. Deep winter, thick snow, and a group of us out for what was supposed to be just a fun snow run in southwestern Washington. There was about 3 feet of snow on the ground, but the packed surface made it feel deceptively easy to move around. We'd set up camp and settled in, but my stepbrother and I, both teenagers at the time, got restless and decided to head out and explore. We weren't prepared. Just jeans, sweatshirts, no real gear, because we thought the snow would keep us afloat. And for a while it did. We wandered off, chasing a raven at one point, watching deer in the distance, just enjoying the freedom of it all. But hours passed, and without realizing it, we'd lost our bearings. The lights started to fade, and we had no idea how far we'd strayed from camp, or in what direction. We tried to retrace our steps, hoping to find the snowmobile tracks we'd followed earlier. But the terrain all looked the same now. Trees, hills, endless snow. As darkness settled in, the surface began breaking under our feet. Our jeans were soaked through, our boots full of ice water, and the cold began cutting deeper than either of us expected. We pushed on for hours. My stepbrother, younger than me, started asking questions I didn't have answers to. Are we close? Are we going the right way? I didn't know. I didn't want to admit it. But I was scared too. The only light we had was a tiny blue keychain light, more of a novelty than a tool. It barely lit anything, and honestly made our eyes hurt more than it helped. My feet had gone completely numb by then. The shivering had stopped. That's when I knew we were in real trouble. When your body stops fighting the cold, it's not a good sign. I started praying, quiet, desperate prayers to anything that might be listening. Eventually we reached another gully, and I told my brother we had to stop, try to get above the snow line somehow. That's when we spotted some large rocks jutting out of the snow. We climbed one, maybe 4 feet high, and sat there huddled together, trying to make noise in hopes that someone might hear us. That's when things took a turn into something I still don't fully understand. At first, it was just sound. Movement in the tree line above us. Something crashing through the brush. I assumed it was elk. But then I caught the smell. A horrible, sickening odor. I've been around elk before. Plenty of times. This wasn't that. Then they appeared. 3 to 5 of them. Shadowy figures. Huge. Fast. Moving with a purpose. They cleared over 200 yards of rough snow-covered terrain in less than 2 minutes. And then they were right there. Surrounding us. Close. 7 feet away. Maybe less. Moonlight made their breath visible. Puffs of heat hanging in the frozen air. I couldn't make out full details, but I could feel them. Whatever they weren't animals. And they weren't people either. They didn't make a sound, just stared at us. Intense, unblinking, like they were reading us, measuring us. The air felt thick, electric, like the whole forest had gone silent just for this moment. And strangely enough, after the panic settled, I realized something else. They didn't seem like they wanted to hurt us. It felt more like an inspection than an attack, like they were just watching, evaluating. Then one of them made a noise, a strange hissing kind of whisper, and just like that, the others snapped cue attention and bolted. Gone. Vanished into the trees as fast as they'd arrived. 20 minutes later, we heard a horn in the distance. Voices shouting. It was my dad and the rest of the crew searching for us with the trucks. To get to them, we had to climb straight up the path the creatures had come down. It took us over 30 minutes to reach the road, proof of just how fast those things had moved compared to us. We were so close to the road the whole time, just one ridge away from safety. We were taken to a doctor afterward, checked for frostbite, given blankets and warm drinks. Physically, we were fine. But something about that night stayed with me. My stepbrother doesn't talk about it much. I'm not even sure how much of it he remembers. He was exhausted, half asleep through the whole thing. But I remember every second of it. I don't know what those creatures were. I don't claim to have all the answers. But I do know one thing. Whatever lives out in those woods, it's not all deer and bears. And when you're cold, lost, and half frozen, when you think nature's going to be your only challenge, you might just find that something else is watching. Something older, something stranger, and something that doesn't want to be found. Story 19. The Haunted Grave and Murder History at Fort Indiantown Gap. This one happened during my last stint in the Army. We were stationed at Fort Indiantown Gap in Pennsylvania, using the area to run an EFMB course, Expert Field Medical Badge. Part of the job meant setting up the land navigation range through the thick woods. I was a proctor, so I spent a lot of time out there, walking the trails, plotting markers, placing grids. At first, it just felt like another task. But the more time I spent in those woods, the stranger it all began to feel. I noticed these odd rock formations in a few areas. At first, I thought nothing of them, probably old foundations from buildings long gone. But then we stumbled onto something different. A grave. An actual headstone, fairly modern looking in terms of craftsmanship, but the date on it was from the 1800s. And beside that grave was a large earthen mound. My partner joked it was probably a horse burial or something, but we didn't know the half of it. That night, just before the night navigation exercise started, a military police officer rolled up and started talking with us. Turns out, he knew all about the grave we'd seen. According to him, it wasn't just some forgotten resting place. It was the grave of a convicted murderer, one of 6 in fact, and that mound next to it. That was the horse they executed along with him. Apparently the crime was sensational back in the day, gruesome enough that it inspired a Sherlock Holmes story by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. But the MP didn't stop there. He said the land around Fort Indiantown Gap had a strange history. More murders, more bizarre accidents, more unexplained deaths than anyone was comfortable talking about. He claimed ghost hunters kept sneaking onto the land, trying to investigate all the stories people whispered about. And honestly, I believe him. Even before I knew any of that, I'd already felt that unease out there. The kind of chill that settles in your spine for no reason. The way the trees seemed too still. The air too quiet, like the past never really left, and the woods are just waiting for someone to listen. And once you know what's buried under your boots, it's hard to walk those trails the same way again. Story 20. The Rocking Man and the Unsolved Woods Murder. This one still gives me a knot in my gut when I think about it. It was late one evening in southern West Virginia. My brother and I were pheasant hunting, just trying to wrap up before dark. If you've ever been in the woods out there at night, you'll understand. It gets heavy fast. The kind of dark that presses in on you. We were about a half-mile from the truck, just following a trail back, when we saw a man sitting on a log off to the side of the path. Just sitting there, rocking back and forth, arms crossed tight over his chest like he was freezing. We stopped and asked if he was all right. He said he was fine. He didn't seem injured, just quiet, maybe a little dazed. We chatted for a bit, made small talk. But then something changed. His whole demeanor shifted. He started looking nervous, glancing over his shoulder. His voice started trembling. "You boys better get going before it gets dark," he said. "Bad things happen in the woods at dark." I'll never forget the way he said it. Like he wasn't just spouting superstition. Like he was talking from experience. My gut told me something was off. Really off. I asked him again if he needed help. If there was anyone we could call. He just shook his head, said no. So we left uneasy but unsure what else we could do. 2 days later, I opened the newspaper and felt my heart drop. They found a body, same exact spot where we saw him, beaten, mutilated. The coroner estimated the time of death to be about 1 hour after we spoke to him. I immediately contacted my uncle, who happened to be a state trooper, and told him everything. We gave our official statements, even had our gear inspected, just to rule us out. They told us to keep quiet about it, while the investigation unfolded. But here's the thing, they never caught the killer, never figured out what really happened out there. And the worst part, the way he acted, the way he spoke, it felt like he knew it was coming. As if he'd already seen what was waiting for him out in those woods, and was just trying to pass along a warning. I still think about him sometimes. Wonder if we should have stayed, should have watched from the trees, done something. But all we did was walk away, and a man died. Maybe we were just too late, or maybe some things in the woods just can't be stopped. Story 21. The Ceramic Demon Face on the Tree. I was around 13 or 14 at the time. My brother and I had always loved exploring the woods near our home. About a mile out, there was this creek and swampy area that felt like our own private playground. And right along the edge of that swamp stood this massive old-growth tree. You know, the kind, thick trunk, sprawling limbs, branches shaped just right for climbing. It was perfect for a tree fort. So we started hauling out scrap wood, nails, tools, all the stuff you need to build something great. We'd been planning it for a week, climbing all over that tree, figuring out where everything should go. Then the weekend rolled around, and we finally set out to start the real construction. We got out there with hammers, nails, saws, and all our building supplies in tow. But right as we started unpacking everything, we saw it. Just above where we'd left our materials, at head height on the trunk, was a face. A strange, devilish-looking ceramic face, nailed directly into the tree. It hadn't been there the day before, and this wasn't something freshly made. It looked old, weathered, covered in cobwebs, moth cocoons, layers of dust and grime, like it had been there for years. But we'd just been climbing that exact spot. We'd been all over that tree, and it absolutely hadn't been there. We ran back home, completely freaked out, told our dad what we found. He came out with us to check it out, and even he looked unsettled. He said it looked like some kind of pagan mask or ritual object. He pulled out a hammer and pried it off the tree. The nail was old, rusted, like it had been embedded there for decades, not a day. He tried to smash it with the hammer, but it didn't break easily, just chipped in a few spots. The nose came off, but that was about it. Frustrated, he tossed it into the swamp. We stood there watching it sink, slowly disappearing beneath the murky water, bubbles rising to the surface, and I swear to you, watching that face fade into the swamp, watching it vanish beneath the waterline. It felt like something had changed, like we'd disturbed something we weren't meant to touch. We never built that fort, and we never went back to that tree. Story 22. The Chanting Cult in the Bushes and the Skulls Camp. I was driving up some Forest Service roads one night. Nothing out of the ordinary, just out enjoying the quiet, taking in the isolation. Then just off the side of the road, I noticed something strange. A man and a woman, both dressed completely in black, standing about 10 feet into a thick clump of bushes. They were holding each other, standing motionless. At first I thought maybe it was just some couple having a moment out in nature. Then I noticed another figure, another person, dressed the same way, standing across the road, also partially hidden in the bushes. That's when I started to get uneasy. A little farther down the road, I saw where they'd come from. A group of people gathered around a fire, dancing, chanting, moving in strange rhythms, all dressed in black, all part of the same group. It wasn't just some party, this was something ritualistic, something unsettling. Later I told my older brother about it. I expected him to laugh it off, but instead he got quiet. He said he'd been in that same area once, years ago, and had seen the same group. Only in his case he didn't stop. He hiked through the woods and accidentally came across their camp. There were animal skulls and bones scattered everywhere. Strange symbols carved into rocks, little shrines tucked away beneath trees. He said he didn't stick around long enough to get a better look, just turned around and got out. As for me, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I went back once, during the day. Dumb idea, I know. But curiosity gets the best of you sometimes. I found one of their markers, still standing. A structure made from wood and bone, placed deliberately, with an eerie kind of care. Whatever they were doing out there, it wasn't just for show. And I have no idea how many more camps like that are hidden deep in those woods. Story 23. The Tree Fort and the Swamp Mask. This one came from a friend of mine, years ago. He told me it happened during his childhood, and it's one of those stories that sticks with you, even secondhand. He and his brother had this favorite spot in the woods, not far from a creek and swamp area. Right at the edge of the swamp stood a massive old-growth tree, the perfect kind of tree for building a fort. Strong limbs, wide trunk, the kind of thing you'd see in an old adventure movie. They spent a week hauling boards, hammers, nails, making plans, climbed all over it, day after day. They knew that tree inside and out. But when the weekend came and they returned to start the build for real, something was different. Right at eye level, nailed into the bark, was a face, a strange, sinister-looking ceramic mask, with features twisted into a devilish grin. It hadn't been there before, and yet it looked like it had been there forever, weathered, crusted in spiderwebs, its paint flaking from age. Their dad came out to see it, and didn't like it one bit, said it looked like something from some kind of ritual. He pulled it down, tried to smash it, but even after a few good hits with a hammer, it barely cracked. So he tossed it, right into the swamp. And the way my friend told it, he still remembers watching it sink, watching it slowly disappear into the dark, murky water. The bubbles rising, the face getting hazier and hazier as it vanished. They never went back to finish the fort. Something about that face, about the way it showed up out of nowhere, aged like it had been there for decades, made them feel like they weren't supposed to be there. And maybe they weren't. Story 24. The Underground Bunker and the Buried Shell. We were somewhere out in the deep sticks near San Antonio, Texas, off the beaten path, far enough out that the trees swallowed the road behind you. It started as just a curiosity, a little exploring trip, until we stumbled on something weird. A structure, old, rusted, sunken into the earth. You wouldn't even notice it unless you were looking closely. It looked like part of an underground bunker, with a corroded metal door lying flat on the ground, almost like a hatch. We tried to open it. It wouldn't budge. There was a rusted lock, and everything about it said, "Do not disturb." Around the edges, the ground looked disturbed, like something had been dug up not too long ago. We poked around a bit more, and that's when we found it. An old artillery shell, just sitting nearby. That was the moment we decided we'd seen enough. We didn't know if the shell was live, how old it was, or what kind of place this really was. But whatever it had been, military site hideout, something worse, it didn't feel abandoned. It felt like a door that wasn't meant to be opened. And with the sun going down, we didn't want to stick around to find out who or what might come back. Story 25. The plane crash and the unknown wing wreckage. This one happened in the mountains of California. I was out hunting, moving along some remote ridge lines, when something caught my eye through the trees. A glint of metal, something unnatural against the brown and green of the forest. I pushed in closer and found it, the wreckage of an old aircraft. There wasn't much left, just a wing warped and burned, sticking out from a patch of underbrush. The rest of the plane was scattered, melted, or buried. No markings I could recognize, nothing obvious to say what kind of aircraft it had been. I called the authorities, told them where it was, but they didn't seem surprised, just logged it and moved on. It didn't make the news. No headlines, no follow-up. And that's the part that still bugs me. Because this wasn't some recent crash. It looked ancient, like it had been there for decades, just sitting quietly under the trees, forgotten. But no debris trail, no crash site perimeter, just that wing, left like a clue, waiting for someone to find it. And maybe not many ever have. Story 26. The ritual sites and party camps in Ithaca Woods. Back when I was in college at Ithaca, we used to explore the woods surrounding campus. There's a lot of it, big expanses of trees, forgotten roads, old trails. Most people didn't bother with it, but I liked to see what was out there. Most of the time it was nothing serious, just the usual, campfire pits, party spots where students would sneak off to get away from campus life. I once found a site not far off the service road, full of old rusted cars and trucks looked like they were from the 1930s or even earlier. It was eerie in a cool way, like walking through an outdoor graveyard for machines. But sometimes, it was more than that. I found another spot higher up in the hills. It was winter, and the snow made everything quiet, still. I followed a set of student footprints through the snow, figuring I'd find another hangout site. What I found was a makeshift shelter. Branches leaned up against a tree, covered with a tarp. Underneath were pitchers, pieces of bottles, and other little signs that it was used regularly. Looked like a place for gravity hits and late-night smoke sessions. Nothing strange yet, but it wasn't the only site out there. I kept exploring, and found another area where things didn't feel so casual. A different kind of setup, more deliberate, more symbolic. There were strange metal spikes driven into trees, arranged in patterns, bits of old fabric, tied in knots, hanging from branches. One place even had a burnt-up lawn chair, and fragments of umbrellas, like a strange ritual had been half-finished and abandoned. And it wasn't just trash. It felt like something had been happening there, something deeper, not just partying, but rituals. I always wondered if anyone else had noticed, or if I'd stumbled into something most people walk right past without even realizing it. Whatever it was, it made me look at those woods differently from then on. Story 27. The Hobo Cliff Camp. It started out as a casual walk on a forest trail. I wasn't looking for anything strange, just enjoying the peace of being out in the woods. But somewhere along the path, I noticed a smaller trail, veering off from the main one, leading up a hill. I followed it, curiosity pulling me in. The trail climbed higher and higher, eventually leading me to the edge of a tall cliff, probably 80 feet high. And at the top, tucked into a clearing, was a makeshift camp, a hobo camp. It had everything you'd expect: tarp coverings, discarded belongings, signs that someone had lived there for a while. It was strangely quiet, though, isolated. Too quiet. I didn't stay long. Something about it felt off. Not just the camp itself, but the feeling of being that far from the trail, hidden up on a cliff where no one would find you. There was this uneasy sense of being watched, like I wasn't alone up there. I turned around and headed back down. Sometimes the weirdest things aren't supernatural. Sometimes it's just the feeling of being somewhere you were never meant to be. Story 28. The Demon Stone Altar and Exploding Camera. Out in the forest, I stumbled across something I wasn't prepared for. It was an altar, not just a pile of rocks or some forgotten junk, but a full-blown altar made of dark, strange stones and what looked like actual skeletal remains. It was eerie, ancient feeling, like it didn't belong to this time or place. Naturally, I pulled out my camera to snap a picture. But the moment I hit the shutter button, something went wrong. The camera burst like it short-circuited, sparked, and then popped apart in my hands. I barely had time to react before I saw something move, something bone-white and wrong. A skeleton. No joke. It lunged at me, fast and aggressive, and I ran. I don't even remember how far I ran, or how I got out of the forest, but I never forgot what I saw, or the way it felt, like the forest spat me back out the moment I tried to document what wasn't meant to be seen. I've never been the same since. Story 29. The Crazy Old Man in the Forest. This one's quick, but it stuck with me in the worst way. I had dozed off while out in the woods one afternoon. Just a quick nap, nothing serious. But I woke up to the weirdest, most disturbing thing imaginable. A crazy old man, hunched over me, doing something wildly inappropriate. I jumped up and bolted. I never saw where he came from, or where he went afterward. Just that awful moment, and the feeling of being completely violated by something that shouldn't have been there. It's the kind of thing that haunts you, not just because it happened, but because you realize how vulnerable you really are in the middle of nowhere. Story 30. Killington Bunkers and Two-Legged Tracks. I was staying near Killington Ski Resort in Vermont when I decided to head out and explore some of the surrounding trails in the mountains. I didn't expect to find anything too wild, just some nice views and maybe a cool photo spot. But I came across these strange concrete structures, big ones, embedded in the hillside like old bunkers or military installations. There wasn't much explanation for why they were there. Just large, looming concrete walls that felt out of place in the middle of the forest. That was odd enough. But what really got to me were the tracks I found in the snow nearby. They looked like bear prints, except they were standing upright. Two-legged, spaced like a person walking, but way too big. Almost like something was walking through the snow that didn't quite belong to either the human or animal world. I kept looking over my shoulder for the rest of that hike. Story 31. Tom the Ladies' Man. Colin's grave. I grew up on a massive stretch of wooded land, 60 acres of forest, deep and quiet. My parents were growers, keeping to themselves, and I spent most of my childhood without much company. So naturally I started wandering the woods. That's how I found Tom. It was a small grave, almost hidden by underbrush. The headstone was old, weathered, and moss-covered. It said Tom Collins, died in the early 1900s, age 27. And beneath that, in quotes, the Ladies' Man. There was something strangely comforting about it. I started visiting the grave regularly, clearing the leaves, tidying it up, talking to Tom like he was a friend. I'd tell him about my day, my problems, my hopes. Even now, years later, I still think about him. I moved away, chased a dream in the city. But sometimes I still catch myself talking to him in my head, like he's still back there, waiting for a visit. I don't know why that grave meant so much to me. Maybe it was just childhood imagination, or maybe I really did feel something out there. Something that made the woods feel a little less lonely. Either way, I hope I get to visit Tom one more time someday. Story 32. The Girl's Underwear Tent in the Woods. It was one of those random explorations. Nothing special at first. I was just wandering deep in the woods, following trails that didn't really go anywhere. That's when I found it. A beat-up old tent. It looked like it had been there for a long time. Sun-faded fabric, torn seams, half collapsed under its own weight. I stepped closer, just curious. That's when I saw what was inside. Among the clutter of forgotten things, there was a piece of clothing, girl's underwear, labeled for a child, around 10 or 11 years old. I stood there, completely frozen. A chill hit me harder than anything else in that forest ever had. Something about it was deeply wrong. It wasn't just unsettling. It was disturbing on a level that made your stomach twist. I didn't stick around. I backed away and left without looking back. To this day, I try not to think about it too much. Some things in the woods, you're better off not understanding. Story 33. Skeleton in the Bay and a Strange Awakening. I was staying in a remote cabin near a bay. Just me, nature, and a week to disconnect. One afternoon, I rented a kayak and decided to paddle across the bay by myself. The water was calm, the air still. It felt peaceful at first. I was halfway across when it happened. Out of nowhere, something jumped out of the water. Something white, bony like a skeleton. I didn't even have time to react before everything went black. When I came to, I wasn't in the kayak anymore. I was deep in the woods, lying on the ground, disoriented, confused and shaken. I had no idea how I got there. No memory of getting out of the water or making it to shore. Just the cold ground beneath me, and a heavy feeling in my chest, like I'd been dragged through something I wasn't meant to experience. To this day, I don't know what happened. Maybe it was a dream. Maybe it was something else, but it changed me in a way I can't explain. Story 34. The Mining Railroad and Uninvited Tenants. I remember hiking out on some land we owned in Northern California, near Etna. It was a beautiful place, quiet, expansive, full of old trails and forgotten corners. On one of those hikes, I stumbled across an old mining railroad track. It was rusted, overgrown, and led to nowhere, just ended abruptly, like it had once served a purpose that time had erased. But that wasn't the only thing I found out there. As I wandered deeper into the property, I started noticing signs, trash, remnants of small fires, makeshift bedding. Someone had been living out there, maybe more than one person. It wasn't just one camp. It looked like people had been squatting across different parts of our land, staying hidden in places no one really went. I never saw them face to face, but the feeling of being watched crept in after that. Every time I went hiking after that day, I kept thinking I'd run into someone, or something, I wasn't supposed to. It's a strange feeling when a place you think you know suddenly doesn't feel like it's yours anymore. Story 35. The Little Fellas and the Sacred Cave Encounter. Not many people talk about them. Not outside the communities that know. And even then, it's rare. You hear stories about Bigfoot, cryptids, strange things in the woods. But there's something else out there. Something older. Something smaller. I grew up in Australia, and part of my heritage comes from Aboriginal blood. I won't go into detail about the tribe, but let's just say, there are things you're not really supposed to talk about. Things that are kept quiet for a reason. My uncle and a second cousin of mine were caretakers of certain sacred sites out in the bushlands, near a mountain range by our hometown on the south coast of New South Wales. As a kid, I used to get to tag along with them sometimes. They'd teach me about bush tucker, wild herbs, berries, plants you could chew to ease pain, even how to dress small cuts, using leaves and roots. One day, they took me deeper than we'd ever gone before, to a place I later learned was completely off limits to outsiders. No white person had ever set foot there, or at least not without serious consequences. But because I was blood family, I was allowed. We approached a cave tucked into the side of a mountain. The entrance wasn't grand. It was small, shadowed, almost easy to miss if you didn't know it was there. Around the entrance were markings, handprints painted on the rock, some of them unusually small. And the fingers, they were long, almost unnaturally long, like they were wearing fake nails or claws. But it wasn't decoration. That was just what their hands looked like. Inside, the walls curved around, and there, stretched across the rock, was an enormous painting, an Aboriginal depiction of a whale, easily 30 feet long. It filled the space like a mural from another time, ancient, sacred. I started to step forward, wanting to explore deeper, but my uncle stopped me. He warned me not to go too far. Then he called out, a strange, drawn-out animal call. Wooey, 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 he echoed into the cave. A moment later, the call came back. Then I saw them. Eyes, reflective, animal-like, glowing faintly in the dim light. And then movement. Something stepped out of the shadows. It was a small, hairy figure, maybe 4 feet tall. Its body was covered in thick, coarse hair, but its face looked human beneath it all. The eyes were intelligent. The skin beneath the fur was pale, almost white. It carried a small wooden club and had tiny bones or bits of wood tied into its facial hair. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a person either. It was something in between. It stepped forward and made a noise, almost like speech, and my uncle responded in the language of our people. They talked. They understood each other. The little being looked at me and gestured, like it recognized I didn't belong, but wasn't afraid of me either, just curious. Later, my uncle explained that these creatures, called the little fellas, had lived side by side with Aboriginal people long ago, before Europeans ever set foot on the continent. There used to be many of them. Now, only a small tribe remained, hidden deep in that cave system, living off berries and roots, staying secret to survive. He told me that keeping them hidden was the only way to protect them. If the world found out, people would exploit them, cage them, ruin what little they had left. I never saw them again. But that day, it never left me. Because sometimes the strangest things hiding in the woods aren't monsters. They're memories from another time, still breathing, just barely, in the cracks of the world we forgot. Story 36. The Trapdoor Shack in the Quesnel Mountains. This one wasn't my story, but it came from a classmate who told it to us one day in passing. Just one of those casual conversations about weird stuff people have experienced. But it stuck with me more than anything else we talked about that day. She had gone up into the mountains near Quesnel, in northern British Columbia, Canada. Just a simple outing, with some friends. They were in a pickup truck, driving around to take in nature, enjoy the peace of the forest. Nothing unusual. Then they spotted it. A shack. It looked abandoned, just sitting there, hidden among the trees, out of place. Curious, they all got out to investigate. The inside of the shack was weird from the start. Damp, cold. The floor was scattered with soggy crackers, just piles of them, like someone had left them behind, or maybe left them as some strange offering. But the strangest part was the trapdoors. There wasn't just one. The shack was full of them. Odd little hidden panels built into the floor, one after another. And when they opened one of them, what they found was even more unsettling. Rusty utensils, knives, spoons, forks, all of it old, corroded, and completely out of place. Something about it didn't feel right. Not just weird, wrong. They didn't stick around. As they stepped back outside, they noticed tracks in the grass leading away from the shack, out into the woods. None of them wanted to follow those tracks. They jumped in the truck and drove away. Fast. None of them ever went back. Story 37. Army Confrontation. After ground vibrations. We were just out there to relax. A few friends and I had driven deep into the woods, way off the grid, to hang out and hotbox the car under the stars. You know, just kick back in the middle of nowhere. Watch it. No das. But as we sat there, everything started to feel off. The ground began to vibrate. Not just a little rumble, it was intense. Like a jackhammer was working just beneath us. The whole car shook like something massive was moving underground. We were all too stunned to speak. And then, before we could even process it, a group of military guys rolled up in a 4x4. They didn't say much, just told us we weren't supposed to be there. Not aggressively, but firmly enough to make it clear we needed to leave. No explanation, no questions answered. It was so bizarre that if we hadn't been a little out of it, I think we would have been way more spooked. But even then, it stuck with me. The timing, the intensity of the vibrations. And then the army showing up out of nowhere. Something was going on out there. something we weren't supposed to see. Story 38. The Rotting Perth Building and the Blood Room. This one came from a friend of mine, a builder who used to do demolition jobs for the city council in Perth, Western Australia. It happened in the early 2000s, on Beaufort Street. There were some old two-story buildings there, probably close to 100 years old. The council had plans to knock them down and build something new, maybe a cafe chain or some shopping complex. My friend and his team were called in to begin the demolition, but the moment they stepped inside, the place was unbearable. The stench hit them like a wall, rotting meat, garbage, body odor, just layers of decay hanging in the air. It was so bad they had to stop work until the place could be cleaned out. They came back a few days later, hoping the smell would be gone. But it wasn't the smell that got them next. It was what they found. Someone was still in the building. They heard shouting from one of the rooms. Turned out it was a homeless man who'd been living in there. They called the police, who came to escort him out. Nothing too dramatic, just unsettling. But the worst part came a few days after that. They returned to resume the demolition, and found a room they hadn't checked before. The walls were covered in dried blood. Rope lay scattered across the floor. No one knew what had happened there, but whatever it was, it hadn't been innocent. My friend didn't go back to that job site after that. Said it was the kind of place you walk into once, but never feel clean again after. Some buildings are better left to rot. Story 39. Skull on a Stick in the Bone Ritual Site. They're 15 when it happened, on vacation with my family near a lake. It was supposed to be a peaceful trip. Just swimming, campfires, walking the shoreline. But I got bored pretty quickly and decided to go off on my own. I wandered further than I probably should have, following the lake's edge as the sun started to dip behind the trees. There was something about that sunset. It made everything look surreal. The water reflected deep orange and red, and the woods got darker by the minute. I figured I'd walk just a little further before heading back. Then I saw it. Something was just off the path about 2 meters away from me. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight to get a better look. And there it was, a human skull, mounted on a wooden pole, just standing there in the clearing like a silent warning. I froze. But it didn't end there. As I looked around, I noticed the ground around it, half-rotten goat heads, bones scattered in the dirt, what looked like a cow skull, and an old rusty knife stuck into the soil. It wasn't just some random dump site. It looked arranged, ritualistic. I didn't wait to find out more. I turned and ran, sprinted straight to the water, and swam across a section of the lake, just to put distance between myself and whatever that was. When I got back to my family, soaked and shaken, I told them everything. But of course, nobody believed me. They said I was just bored, that I probably made it up to add excitement to the trip. But I know what I saw, and something about those woods wasn't natural. Story 40. The fires beneath the snow. I was stationed at Fort Wainwright, near Fairbanks, Alaska. In summer, a massive forest fire tore through the area, burned up miles of land out in the Tanana Flats. For weeks, everything smelled like smoke, and ash fell like dirty snow from the sky. But that wasn't the end of it. Winter came, and with it, heavy snowfall, 18 inches, maybe 2 feet in some areas. Temperatures dropped below -35 degrees Fahrenheit. Everything should have been frozen solid. But then came the night flight. I was doing night vision training with an instructor pilot and a junior warrant officer, just a routine exercise, flying over the flats. I was in the back of the helicopter, scanning the ground under NVGs, when I spotted something strange, a little light flickering near the base of a tree. At first, I thought it might have been a trapper out there. People in the area often get permits to set traps, even in winter. But as we circled around for a better look, we spotted more lights. Dozens of them, all near the stumps of trees. Tiny glowing dots, scattered across the frozen forest floor. Then we realized what it really was. The forest fire was still burning. under the snow. Somehow, despite the cold, despite the thick layer of frost and ice, the fire was smoldering beneath it all, feeding off the peat and roots underground. It had never truly gone out. It was still alive. We kept spotting them throughout the winter, those glowing patches of heat hiding under the snow, quietly burning away. It shook us, and I started to wonder, how long had they been burning? Could a fire like that survive for years? Decades? Could we be looking at the remnants of ancient flames, embers from another time, still breathing under our feet? No one ever talks about that kind of fire. The kind you never see until it's too late. Story 41. The Ghost Car on the Abandoned Road. There's an old road near my house, abandoned and blocked off by 3 tall signposts, so no cars can get through anymore. Nobody really uses it. It's just there, slowly being reclaimed by nature, with trees creeping in on either side, and weeds growing through the cracks in the pavement. I never thought much of it. Just another forgotten road left behind by the city. But one evening, I saw something that changed that. A car. Not just any car. An old one. Looked like something from the 1930s. It came rolling down the road, slow and smooth, like it was floating through time. I thought maybe it was a collector's car, just someone out for a drive. But then it vanished. Right at the end of the road, it was just gone. No engine sound, no tire marks, nothing. One moment it was there, and the next it wasn't. I don't have an explanation. Maybe I never will. But now, every time I pass that abandoned road, I find myself looking twice, just in case that old car decides to show up again. Story 42. The Humanoid Creature Crossing the Road. It was a quiet fall night. Me and a friend were just walking down a rural road, forest on both sides, not expecting anything unusual. It was dark by then, the kind of dark where shadows blur the edges of everything, and every sound feels a little more alive. Then we saw it. Something burst from the trees to our right, fast low to the ground, but definitely not an animal. It sprinted across the road in just a couple seconds, disappearing into the woods on the other side. But I saw it. A humanoid shape, thin, hunched, brownish in color, with odd red markings or spots across its body. It didn't move like a person. It didn't move like anything I've seen before. I turned to my friend, hoping I was just seeing things, but his face told me otherwise. He saw it, too. Same expression, same frozen shock. We didn't say anything. We just turned and walked quickly back to his place, neither of us willing to speak until we were safely inside. To this day, I don't know what it was, but we both know it wasn't human, and we both know it's still out there, in those trees. Story 43. Swastika Alley and the Pighead Ritual Site. This happened about a year ago. I live in Germany, and there's a forest near where I usually go hiking. One day, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to wander off the main trail, just to see what was out there. Not long after I veered off the path, I noticed something strange. The trees, they had markings, carvings, swastikas, scratched crudely into the bark, dozens of them. The trees were lined up like an eerie pathway, guiding me deeper into the woods. It was unsettling, but I kept going. I wanted to know what was at the end. After about 5 minutes, I smelled it. A stench that hit me hard, like decay and rot. I kept walking, drawn forward, despite everything in me screaming to turn around. Then I saw the source. Pigheads, decaying, mounted on wooden spears, arranged in a circle around what looked like an altar. Burnt down candles, charred remains, and strange symbols etched into the ground. On the altar itself was a black and white photo of what I later recognized as the Black Sun symbol, an occult image associated with extremist ideologies. Scattered around were pieces of paper, notes with hateful slurs, and strange slogans scribbled on them. Some targeted one political group, others insulted the opposite side. It didn't make sense. It wasn't clearly left or right. It was chaos. Just hate, thrown in every direction. Whatever it was, It didn't feel like simple vandalism. It felt like a message, a warning, a ritual that didn't care who or what it was aimed at, only that it left a stain behind. I didn't go back. I couldn't. That forest hasn't felt the same since. Story 44. The Wire Camp and the Nailed Tree Shrine. This one takes me back about 7 years. When I used to hang out with a friend who lived near the edge of a forest in California, we'd explore the riverbanks behind her house, just wandering around, seeing what we could find. Usually it was just old junk or animal bones. But one time we wandered farther than ever before, probably miles from her place. And that's when we found it. A strange clearing, littered with wires strung across trees. Not electrical wires. Random cords, ropes, cables, woven like someone had tried to build something or make a trap. There were couches set up in a semicircle, facing what looked like a small fire pit. Surrounding it were cans filled with rocks, leaves, and other strange materials. Like someone had been conducting some kind of ritual, or maybe just playing out some idea they couldn't let go of. And then there were the trees. Nailed into the bark were odd items, pieces of clothing, small broken tools, and little tokens that didn't seem to belong to any particular purpose. It all felt uncomfortably intentional. We didn't stay long. It wasn't just the unease of being somewhere that felt abandoned. It was the overwhelming sense that whoever had made that place hadn't just left. They could have come back at any moment. Story 45. The unseen sound in the sky at summer camp. When I was around 13, I went to summer camp out in central Pennsylvania, rural, isolated. The kind of place where the stars feel like they're right above your head and the trees make the nights impossibly dark. One night, I woke up for no real reason. It was quiet in the tent, but I had this weird feeling like something was off. Then I heard it. A sound in the sky. I couldn't describe it then, and I still can't now. It wasn't a plane or a helicopter. It was this strange humming, almost mechanical, but low and constant. It felt like it was hovering just above the treetops, unmoving, holding itself in the air without ever shifting. I was too creeped out to look outside. I just stayed in my sleeping bag, frozen, pretending I didn't hear it. The next morning, by the campfire, another counselor brought it up. He asked if there were supposed to be satellites or aircraft flying over during the night. Said he'd seen something strange in the sky, something that didn't move like anything he'd seen before. No one else mentioned it after that. It was like everyone wanted to forget it. But I never did, because whatever that sound was, it wasn't from around here. Story 46. The Dead Baby in the Guitar Case. This one changed everything for me. When I was a kid, maybe 11 or 12, I used to explore the woods near my home in the Sierra Nevada mountains. There were old cabins scattered around, mostly leftovers from the mining era, and I'd spend hours combing through the ruins looking for anything interesting. One day, I found an old cabin, partially collapsed, rotting from the inside out. The smell hit me before I even stepped inside. It was thick, heavy, like something had died in there. Still, I pushed forward. I found the usual junk bottles, cans, rusted tools, but then I saw something that caught my eye. A guitar case. It was old and worn, covered in dust and grime, with the latches rusted shut. But I was excited, hoping I'd find a guitar I could fix up and learn to play. I worked at it until the latch finally gave way. And what I found inside will never leave me. It wasn't a guitar, it was a body, a small one, a baby. I froze completely numb. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just shut the case and stumbled out of that cabin in a daze. Halfway home, I finally broke down, started vomiting uncontrollably. I couldn't stop shaking. It took me days to tell my parents what I'd seen. When I did, they called the sheriff. The authorities went out to investigate, and it made the local paper. But they never figured out who it was or how it happened. That day changed me. The woods stopped feeling like a playground. They became a graveyard. Story 47. Car Graveyard. Below the cliff, I was 17 when this happened. A few friends and I were hiking around near Boulder, just looking to get outside, maybe find a quiet place to hang out and pass around a bowl. Eventually, we stumbled into a clearing, and that's when we saw them. Cars, a whole collection of them, rusted out and half consumed by the forest. They were old, really old, mostly from the 1940s and 50s, but some even older than that. The kind of vehicles you'd see in a museum, except these were decaying, forgotten in the dirt. It was surreal. We poked around, checked out the interiors, laughed at the old upholstery, even pulled a few emblems off just for kicks. I found a Ford V8 badge still attached and kept it as a souvenir. Then we looked up, right above the clearing. Way up the cliff was a sharp turn in the road, steep and blind. That's when it hit us. These weren't just old cars dumped here. They crashed here. Over time, one by one, they must have missed that turn and tumbled off the edge, falling straight down into this forgotten graveyard of twisted metal. It was a strange feeling, smoking a bowl in a car where someone probably spent their final moments decades ago. It made the place feel haunted. Not by ghosts, but by the weight of time. Story 48. The strange artifact near Mount St. Helens. I was out near Mount St. Helens, hunting in a remote part of a national forest. I'd won a tag that let me legally take part in a special deer population control program, and figured it would be a peaceful solo trip. But while hiking through a narrow creek bed, I found something strange. Hidden under a small rock shelter was an object, half buried, covered in dirt and moss. It wasn't natural. It looked like a carved artifact, something old but with shapes and lines that didn't feel like any native designs I'd seen before. It was almost alien. Not in the sci-fi sense, but in that primal way where your gut tells you something's not meant to be found. I dug it out carefully, and brought it to a nearby ranger station. The staff were shocked, said it was a rare archaeological piece, and took it to be examined further. Eventually, it ended up in a museum. They thanked me, even put my name on a little placard as the one who found it. But to be honest, I wish I hadn't touched it. Even now, something about that moment lingers, like the forest had buried it for a reason. And I was the one who pulled it back into the light. Story 49. The nudist tent camp in the clearing. It was about 8 years ago, in Louisiana. I was out hunting on a piece of public land with a friend. We had walkie-talkies, and after a few hours apart he radioed me, sounding excited, but hushed. He told me to meet him by a specific bayou. Said there was something I had to see to believe. I figured maybe he'd found an old still or a hidden campsite. Something cool, but nothing too crazy. When I got there, we crossed the bayou, and hiked a bit deeper into the woods until we came to a small clearing. We crouched behind some brush, and he pointed out into the open. There were tents, 4 or 5 of them, set up in a loose circle. At first, I thought it was just a group of campers. But then I saw her, completely unclothed, walking casually from one tent to another. A moment later, a different person, also unclothed, emerged from a different tent, and went into hers. Then another switch, and another. It kept happening, people moving between tents like some kind of rotation. Men and women, all of them casual, like this was just normal for them. We watched for a few minutes in total silence, then backed out the way we came, careful not to be seen. To this day, I don't know what that was. A nudist gathering, a secluded lifestyle group, something else entirely. All I know is that wasn't a place we were meant to find. Story 50. The abandoned camper frozen in time. A few years ago, I was out kayaking with a friend. We'd found a nice rapid along the river, and spent a while playing in it, paddling back and forth, just having fun. Eventually, we pulled off to the bank to rest, and that's when we saw it. Hidden just beyond the tree line was an old camper trailer, rusted, sun-bleached, half swallowed by vines and brush. We walked over to check it out. The license tag had expired in 1983, but it wasn't just old, it was frozen. like someone had walked away in the middle of living there, and never came back. Everything was still set up. A skillet rested on a little gas stove, vintage drinks in the fridge, cups and condiments neatly placed on the table, clothes hung up on a line, as if someone had just done laundry. It wasn't a mess, it was organized, preserved. It looked like someone had been making breakfast, stepped outside, and vanished. We joked about aliens, but the more we looked, the less funny it felt. The stillness wasn't just eerie, it was haunting. A slice of life left untouched for decades, surrounded by a forest that had quietly moved on without it. We never found any clues about who had been there. But that camper, still and untouched, told a story, all on its own. Like the forest decided to hold its breath, and just never let go. Story 51. The Forgotten Film Studio. In the forest, I was exploring a wooded area in Broward County, Florida, when I stumbled across something I never expected to find out there. It was a building, 2 stories tall, tucked deep into the trees, with a faded, barely legible sign on the front that read Gordon Studios. It looked abandoned, but not completely destroyed. The place had the feel of a film production site, like it was used for commercials or industrial films, back when people still used places like this instead of green screens. Inside, it was eerie. Empty office rooms with old desks and filing cabinets. There were props still lying around. Random objects that looked like they belonged to different sets. Basic interiors, nothing flashy, just a lingering sense that something used to happen here, and then one day it just stopped. Outside the main building were rows of decaying cars, and not far from that, there was another structure, something like a small motel, 4 or 5 rooms, laid out like a miniature roadside inn. Everything was overgrown with vines, weeds curling up the walls, nature reclaiming whatever was left. I never found any documents or history about what Gordon Studios really was, or why it was left to rot. But standing there, looking at the collapsed sets and the long-dead parking lot, it felt like I had walked into the memory of a forgotten story, a place where creativity once lived, and then simply vanished. Story 52. The newspaper clipping hallway and the slammed door. When I was about 13, 2 friends and I decided to explore an old industrial building that had been abandoned for as long as we could remember. It sat on the outskirts of town, like a rusted skeleton, something you saw in passing, but never really looked at. We brought BB guns with us, just planning to mess around, break a few bottles, cause some harmless mischief. But once we got inside, the mood shifted. There were strange things everywhere, not just debris or graffiti, but bizarre, out-of-place objects. In one area, that looked like a loading dock hallway, we found something that made us stop in our tracks. A wall, covered with newspaper clippings, dozens of them, pinned, taped, even glued to the surface. Every one of them about fires, murders, disappearances, nothing but dark headlines and grim stories. And they weren't old. Many were dated well after the building was supposed to have been abandoned. It was like someone had been living there, collecting these stories. For what reason, we couldn't guess. Then we saw it, a huge axe lying across a table nearby. None of us touched it. None of us said a word. And then came the noise. A bang. Loud, sudden, like a heavy door, slamming shut deep in the building. We didn't stick around to find out what caused it. We bolted. No words, no hesitation, just instinct. Whatever was in that building, we weren't supposed to see it. Story 53. The caravan and milk canisters in the Olympia Woods. I live in Olympia, Washington. Out here, it's not unusual to find weird old junk scattered in the deeper parts of the woods, remnants from past decades, rusting under moss and time. But there's one thing out on my property that's always given me pause. A caravan-style wagon, just sitting there, half-tilted, like it hadn't been touched in decades. The wood is rotting, the wheels sunken into the ground, but it still holds its shape, like it's waiting for something. Nearby, there are metal milk canisters, Those old tin ones from generations ago, just sitting out in the open, slowly being swallowed by weeds. Nobody knows how they got there. My family's owned the land for years, and they've got no record of anyone ever hauling that wagon out there. It's just there, part of the landscape now, a quiet, forgotten mystery. Story 54. The human arm on the fern wire table. It started with a photo. Someone on the thread shared an image. Nothing fancy at first glance, just a shot of something in the woods. But then people started looking closer. There in the middle of the scene was a strange structure. Something that looked like a table, crudely built from fern sticks and twisted wire. It was small, maybe waist height, surrounded by moss-covered rocks and forest debris, and resting on top of it, what looked like a human arm. The image wasn't clear enough to confirm anything. It could have been a prop, a sculpture, a twisted trick of light, but the detail was there. The shape, the proportions, even the angle of the elbow and fingers. Someone in the thread swore they'd seen something just like it once before. It's the kind of thing that sticks with you. Not because you know what it is, but because you don't. That table, that arm, it looked like part of something else. Like a ritual, a warning, or maybe just a piece of something bigger, hidden deeper in those woods. Either way, nobody wanted to go back and find out. Story 55. The Black Sun Altar and Pig Head Ritual in Germany. This one's mine. Happened about a year ago, here in Germany. I was out walking through a nearby forest. Nothing unusual, just taking a break from everyday life. At some point, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to stray off the main path. I didn't think much of it at first, until I started noticing something strange. The trees were marked, dozens of them, each one scratched with swastikas, not painted, carved. The symbols were rough and crude, as if someone had used a knife or something sharp. And they weren't random. They formed a sort of pathway, an alley of marked trees leading deeper into the woods. I followed it, unsure why. Eventually the smell hit me, rot, thick and overwhelming. And then I saw them, pig heads, rotting, impaled on tall wooden spears, a full circle of them. In the middle an altar, charred candles burned down to wax stubs, a photo of the black sun placed at its center. The whole thing looked like it had been used recently, but no one was around. Scattered across the ground were scraps of paper, rants, insults, slogans. Some were aimed at the far right, others at the far left. None of it made clear sense. It wasn't politics, it wasn't ideology. It felt like madness, a place where hate had no direction, just intensity. I didn't stay long, but even after I left that forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled into something much deeper than a few crude carvings, or a strange altar. It felt like something had been left behind there, something that wanted to be found. Story 56. The wrecked WW's plane discovery. It was just a quick hike, nothing more. I'd found this spot out in the woods, not far from where some old war training grounds used to be, and I figured I'd explore a bit. Didn't expect to find a plane, an actual wrecked aircraft, half buried under leaves and dirt, the metal frame weathered but still recognizable, wings bent and torn, fuselage rusting, but parts of it still intact, and on the side, clear as day, the old U.S. Air Force emblem from the 1939-1949 era. It was a relic of the Second World War, just sitting there, in the middle of the woods, forgotten. No signposts, no plaque, just rusted metal and silence. Some say people drag parts of planes out there as a prank, just to mess with hikers. But this didn't feel like a prank. It felt like history had been left behind, and nature simply moved on. Story 57. The creepy creekside structure in Pittsburgh. I was walking through a wooded area outside Pittsburgh, near a shallow creek that ran through the trees. The place wasn't remote, but it still had that quiet, secluded vibe you only find near flowing water. That's when I saw it. A structure right in the middle of the creek, a strange formation that looked almost like a miniature dam or a broken bridge, made of stone and wood. It didn't match anything around it. No trail markers, no signs, just this odd symmetrical thing, half submerged in the water. It didn't look new. In fact, it looked like it had been there for decades, slowly crumbling but still holding on. I don't know what it was. I don't know why it was there. But standing near it, watching the water flow around the edges, I got the distinct feeling that it wasn't just some forgotten construction project. It felt older, purposeful, like it had a use once, but no one remembers what it was. Story 58. The Deer Skull Shrine in the Ozark Cave. Some caves are just caves. Others feel like something more. I was exploring a deep cave near the Ozark Mountains, about 40 feet underground, when I found it. A strange stone platform, almost like a shrine. Sitting right in the middle of it was a deer skull, positioned with care. It wasn't just tossed there. It had been placed, balanced, displayed. The space around it was oddly clean, as if someone had taken time to maintain that small section of cave. No graffiti, no trash, just a single image etched in the shadows, a ritual site hidden away from the surface world. I brought the skull outside briefly to take a picture of it in the daylight, but something about the whole experience left me uneasy. Out of respect, or instinct, I returned the skull to where I found it. Some things are better left where they belong. Story 59. The Grave in the Snow. It was still dark when I arrived on public hunting land I'd never been to before. There was fresh snow on the ground, and I followed a worn deer trail through the brush until I found a good spot to sit and wait for sunrise. When the sun finally came up, I noticed something odd just a few feet away from where I'd been sitting all morning. A tombstone, partially buried under the snow. I walked over and brushed it off with my hand. The stone was old, weathered. It read, Nathan Powell 1739-1826, Reverend, War, New Jersey Militia. That's what stuck with me. A Revolutionary War soldier, buried in the middle of nowhere. No markers, no signs, just a single stone in the woods. He was a long way from New Jersey, and I was a long way from feeling comfortable in those woods ever again. Story 60. The Forest That Watches. My family owns a small plot of woodland, about 20 acres, just outside of Rochester, Minnesota. Nothing too remote, but something about it always felt off. Every time we're out there, it's the same eerie feeling, like the trees are watching, like something unseen is just barely out of reach. We found twisted deer legs on the ground, like they'd been snapped in half with force, not cut. Heard rocks being smashed together, heavy thuds echoing through the woods with no source. You know that feeling, when the hairs on your neck stand up for no reason. That's the baseline out there. Once we heard high-pitched screams, echoing from opposite ends of the woods, almost like two voices communicating with each other in some strange language of sound. We'd also find massive footprints near the edge of the cornfield, too large to be human, too spaced out to be from any animal we know. But the weirdest part happened when I was 12. We were at a camping spot on a ridge above a ravine. I heard one of those loud thumps again, so I grabbed a stick and pounded on a tree, just messing around. 5 seconds later, another thump came back, not from the same direction, but farther away. A reply. I pounded the tree again. Another reply echoed through the woods. It kept going for a while, back and forth, almost like a conversation in knocks. I don't know what it was. Maybe nothing, but it didn't feel like nothing. It felt like something was out there, listening. Story 61. The Claymore Trap and Mountain Echoes. I was camping in the hills of Tennessee, way out in the woods, 40 miles from any road. It was supposed to be peaceful. I'd made a fire, settled in for the night, and was just enjoying the quiet when a loud crack echoed through the trees. It wasn't a branch breaking, it was sharper, heavier. I grabbed my rifle and went to check it out. That's when I found him, a young boy, laying there in the dirt. I didn't know what to do at first. It looked like he'd stepped on some kind of homemade trap, something like a claymore, rigged up by someone who knew what they were doing. I called the authorities, but the boy was already gone. They said he didn't have any ID, likely someone who'd crossed the border illegally. The area was cleared after that. But the weird part isn't even that. While I was hunting up there in the mountains, I'd seen strange lights in the distance before. Not campfires, not lanterns. Lights that moved too fast, too smooth. Lights that flickered and pulsed like they were dancing across the treetops. And once, I swear I heard chanting echoing from the hills. Not English, something older, rhythmic, like an ancient song carried by the wind. I haven't gone back since, not because of the trap, because of everything else. Story 62. The Bone Hut on the mountain. I was just a kid when it happened, maybe 6 or 7 years old. We were walking alongside the mountain trail, my cousins and I. It was just supposed to be a simple hike, something to burn time during a quiet afternoon. But that trail, it didn't stay normal for long. First we started seeing bear traps, 1 or 2 at first, rusted, half buried in the dirt. But then they started to show up more often, scattered across the path, getting denser and more frequent the farther we walked. It was strange, even to us as kids. Who leaves that many traps out? Why in such a concentrated area? Eventually, the trail opened up into a clearing. The bushes were flattened, the grass stomped down. Something had been there, something big, maybe multiple somethings. But in the center of it all, there was a structure, a small stone building, low to the ground like a bunker. It had no door, just an open entrance that led down into the earth. It didn't look like a cabin. It didn't even look human. It looked like something ancient, like it wasn't meant to be found. We stepped inside. That's when it got worse. The walls were lined with bones. Piles of them, so many that the floor was half covered. Long bones, short bones, broken pieces scattered everywhere, and human remains. There were skulls, too. I remember clearly, one sitting at the top of a pile, and another fixed to the wall, like it had been fastened there intentionally. Some of the bones were stapled to the walls, not hung, stapled, like someone wanted them displayed. There was a red symbol painted near the back wall, but I was too young to make sense of it. I don't remember what it looked like, just that it was there, and that it felt wrong. I didn't feel afraid at the time. I think I was too young to understand what I was looking at. But that image has stuck with me ever since. When we left, we didn't talk about it. Not on the way home, not after. It just vanished from conversation. Like we all knew it was better not to speak about it. But now, years later, I find myself thinking about it more and more, wondering what was really down there, who built it, what those bones meant, and part of me wants to go back, just to see if it's still there. Story 63. Haunted swamp shelter and 4-day ordeal in the bayou. Hunting in the bayou is nothing like hunting in the woods. You don't just get lost. You disappear. The swamp swallows everything. I was out on a 2-day trip, scouting deep into Mississippi's wetlands. It was supposed to be simple. Track some deer, set up camp, head back before the worst of the heat rolled in. Then I dropped my GPS in the swamp. 1 second it was in my hand, the next it was gone, sucked into the mud, lost beneath the black water. No signal, no trails. Just an endless sprawl of cypress trees and waterlogged ground, stretching in every direction. My 2-day trip turned into 4. By the 3rd night, I was exhausted. I had no clue how far I'd wandered, how far I was from anything familiar. That's when I saw it. A house, just sitting there, deep in the swamp, miles from any town, no roads leading to it, no signs of a cleared path. It was old. Gray, weathered wood, half sunken into the marsh, but still standing. I wasn't about to turn down shelter. The inside was unsettling. The walls were covered in old newspapers, yellowed and curling at the edges. Scattered across the floor were empty shotgun shells, dusty cans, and what looked like pieces of an old radio. It had the look of a place that had been used, abandoned, then used again by whoever or whatever found it next. Then I noticed the stains, dried dark smears on the walls, on the floor, by the doorway, by the old upright piano in the corner, and the bloody handprint. It was right there on the wooden paneling, near the piano keys, faded but unmistakable. I tried to ignore it. It was late. I needed rest. I set up my gear in the hallway, used some fishing line to rig a tripwire, just in case, and tried to sleep. I didn't. Something moved above me. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, in the attic above my head. There was no way anyone else had made it out here. I hadn't seen a soul for days. The swamp itself was the only thing I had heard. Frogs, insects, the occasional splash of something shifting in the water. But this was different. I gripped my shotgun and waited. The footsteps continued for hours, pausing, then starting again, like whoever or whatever was up there, was waiting for me to react. At some point, exhaustion won out. I must have drifted off for a little while, because the next thing I knew, the sun was creeping through the gaps in the walls. I grabbed my gear and got out of there. But before I left, I stepped outside and saw something I hadn't noticed the night before. A noose. It was still hanging from a low tree branch outside the house, swaying slightly in the morning air. The rope was frayed, old, but it hadn't rotted away completely. I didn't stick around to examine it. I just started walking. It took me the rest of the day, but I finally found a familiar stream, followed it downstream, and got back to civilization. I don't know who built that house. I don't know who or what was up there in the attic. But I do know one thing. Some places weren't meant to be found, and some things don't leave just because you do. Story 64. Ghost Woman at the Graveyard. Bench. I was in high school when it happened. Just doing the usual dumb stuff you do when you're that age. A few of us were hanging out, talking about a cemetery that people always said was haunted. We didn't know exactly where it was. Just a vague idea. Somewhere off a dead-end road, out past town. Eventually we found it. Pure luck. The road led to a hill, and at the top was a streetlight. As we drove under it, the light went out. That alone was creepy enough. But we kept going, fueled by curiosity and whatever teenage courage we thought we had. According to the local legend, if you drove around the cemetery 12 times, the graves would start to glow. So we tried it. 12 times around, nothing. 13. Still nothing. Tried it in reverse. Same deal. Eventually we parked and got out. Just stood there in the quiet, talking. That's when I saw her. Across the cemetery, on a bench lit from behind by a faint light, there was a woman. She was just sitting there completely still, like she'd been there the whole time. Her hair was long and dark, and she wore what looked like a nightgown that moved slightly in the wind. I stared at her, frozen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't just a shadow or a trick of the light. It was a figure, a person. We all saw her. And when we finally worked up the nerve to walk toward the bench, she was gone. Just vanished. There was nothing there. No one hiding behind it. No sign anyone had been there at all. But I can still see her in my mind, sitting there staring back at us across the graveyard. Story 65. The grave down the Colorado hillside. It was a hike like any other. My dad and I were out in northern Colorado, following a trail deep into the woods. It was getting late, and he wanted to set up camp before nightfall. But I saw something off the side of the trail, a shape at the bottom of a hill, something gray, something out of place. I pointed it out, but my dad wasn't interested, said we needed to keep moving. Still, I couldn't let it go. So we made our way down. When we got there, even my dad froze. It was a grave, or at least something like one. There was no headstone, no marker, just a mound, framed in stone, weathered by time and completely hidden from the trail above. It felt wrong. There was nothing around it. No name, No dates, no clue who might be buried there or why someone had gone to the trouble of building it so far out into the wilderness. It didn't feel like an old family site or anything historical. It felt isolated, like it had been put there to be forgotten. We didn't stay long. Some places, even without words, speak loud enough to tell you to leave. Story 66. The boot on the table. It wasn't even deep woods, just an abandoned factory hidden in the edge of the forest. A group of us had gone exploring one afternoon, just for fun. We ended up finding a way in through a boarded-up door, and started poking around. Eventually, we came across the old locker room. It was pitch black inside, everything covered in dust, rusted lockers, cracked tiles, and right there in the middle of the room was a single boot, just sitting on a table, perfectly placed. There was nothing particularly special about it. No blood, no note, no eerie markings. But the second we saw it, the room felt colder, heavier. It just didn't make sense. Why there? Why so deliberately placed? None of us could explain it, but we all felt it, that creeping pressure in your chest, like the room didn't want you there. We left shortly after, heard what might have been a voice echoing behind us as we went, but we didn't stick around to find out. Sometimes it's not what you see that gets to you. It's what you feel the moment you see it. Story 67. The symbol in the trees. It happened while me and a buddy were hiking through a patch of woods we hadn't explored before. There wasn't anything particularly strange about the place at first, just trees, a few game trails, and the occasional rustle of wildlife in the underbrush. Then we saw it. Hanging from one of the branches was a strange symbol, something woven, almost floral in its pattern. At first glance, it looked like a kind of Celtic knot, but the way it was hanging, it didn't feel decorative. It felt deliberate. As we were staring at it, trying to figure out what it meant, or why it was even there, a deer suddenly burst out of the tree line nearby, bolting past us like it had been spooked by something deeper in the woods. That was enough to make us jump out of our skins. To this day, I'm not sure what the symbol really meant. Some people say it might have just been a kite, or some tangled bit of rope caught in the branches. But we both felt something when we saw it. Something ancient, something watching. Story 68. The cabin window. Sometimes it's not what you see that unnerves you, it's what you feel. I once stayed in a small cabin, nothing fancy, just a rustic little spot with a view of the forest and a bed right across from a large window. I don't know how to explain it, but every single night I was there, I felt it. That strange sensation, that weight, that quiet sense that something was watching me from outside, just beyond the glass. I'd wake up during those early hours before sunrise, heart racing, convinced something was standing on the other side of the window. But every time I looked, nothing. Until the last morning. I woke up and the window was shattered, completely broken. Glass everywhere, cold air pouring in, and not a single sound had woken me when it happened. No animals nearby, no footprints in the soft ground outside, just broken glass, and a feeling I couldn't shake. Whatever it was, it didn't want to be seen. Story 69. The hillside bunker above Cape Town. There's a trail that winds through the hills overlooking Cape Town. Quiet, scenic, and usually empty. I was hiking it alone one afternoon, just taking in the view, when I stumbled across something buried in the hillside. A bunker. Concrete and steel, half swallowed by time, sunken into the dirt like it had tried to hide itself from the world. There was no door, just a narrow entrance barely visible beneath the brush. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. The moment I stood near it, I felt it. That old stale feeling like the air had been trapped there for decades. It wasn't paranormal, not exactly, just heavy. The kind of place that whispers to your instincts to keep walking. And I did. Story 70. The mansion in the Smoky Mountains. It started with a tip from a local game warden. A quiet mention of some old ruins buried deep in the Smoky Mountains, far from any trail. He said it'd be a great place to camp, maybe take in some sights. What he didn't say was how hard it would be to find. It was a 5-hour hike through unmarked terrain. No trail markers, no signs, just dense forest, and the occasional faint path left by animals. But eventually, we found it. What remained of a mansion. A crumbling, forgotten structure perched above a private lake. It must have been something grand once. There was a large stone fireplace, an open space that might have once been a ballroom or a gathering hall. The walls were all but gone, the brickwork scattered in the undergrowth, but you could still feel the shape of the place. You could still feel the presence of something old. There weren't any artifacts left behind. No furniture, no keepsakes, just hollow, broken rooms and silence. The kind of silence that presses in on you. We camped nearby that night, but sleep didn't come easy, even without ghosts or strange sightings. Some ruins carry a memory in the air, a feeling that you've walked into someone else's story, and that for a moment, the house remembers you too. Story 71. The circle of hanging chickens. I was hiking toward a small fishing spot with a few friends, just cutting through a stretch of wooded trail we'd used before. It was one of those shaded paths, tall trees overhead, quiet underfoot, a little too still. That's when we found it. Right in the middle of the trail, lying there like it had just fallen from the sky, was a deer leg. But not just any leg. It was skinned completely clean, raw, exposed, and torn off like it had been yanked violently, not cut or dressed by a hunter. None of us said much. We just stepped around it, confused, maybe a little creeped out. Hunting wasn't even allowed in that area, so it made even less sense. We kept walking, pushing toward the fishing spot, but about 10 minutes later, we hit a clearing, and that's when it got worse. Hanging from the trees, maybe 6 or 8 of them, were chickens, dead, suspended by their legs, each one swaying gently in the breeze. The way they were spaced, the way they circled the clearing, it looked deliberate, ritualistic. Not a single feather out of place, not a single sign of blood, just a perfect, eerie display right in the middle of nowhere. It sent chills through all of us. At first I thought maybe it was bait for some kind of predator, but it didn't make sense. You don't hang chickens high in trees for coyotes. And if it was for some kind of ceremony, I didn't want to know the details. We got out of there quick. There are places in the woods where you feel like you've walked into someone else's world. This was one of them. Story 72. The plain on the mountain. I was hunting with my uncle deep in the Pacific Northwest. Thick forests, old logging roads. The kind of terrain where cell signal goes to die. We had pulled off a trail to look across a valley, just scanning the tree line with binoculars. Nothing unusual, just a break in the hunt. But then I spotted something strange. A white shape off to the side, where the regrowth trees met the older section of forest. It didn't look natural. It had hard edges, sharp corners, something distinctly out of place in all that green. I handed the binoculars to my uncle. He looked for a long time before nodding. "Looks like a plane," he said. And it did. There were no roads out there, no trails leading to that spot. Whatever it was, it had been sitting there for decades. We figured it would take at least 2 hours of hard hiking just to reach it. And we weren't prepared for that kind of detour that day. We planned to go back another time, maybe investigate it properly. But we never did. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there, just sitting in silence among the trees, slowly being reclaimed by moss and time. A forgotten crash site, a story without an ending, and maybe someone still waiting to be found. Story 73. Haunted desert grave and the family that shouldn't have touched it. Some things are better left untouched. This was one of them. It started in the desert, remote, quiet, far from anything resembling civilization. My family had gone out there for a trip. My dad had an operation scheduled soon, and wouldn't be able to hike or walk much for a while. So this was one last adventure before he'd be stuck at home for months. That's when we found it. a grave. Small, crumbling, weathered by the wind and sun. The writing on the stone was almost unreadable, like time had worn away everything it didn't want us to see. There was a small metal plaque at the base, half buried in the sand. And then we made the mistake. We took a piece of it. Just a small chunk from the edge of the stone, cracked off, pocketed without much thought. A souvenir, maybe. A keepsake from a strange little moment in the desert. It wasn't long before things started to go wrong. At first it was little stuff. Scratching sounds, whispers when no one else was in the room. Lights flickering, doors creaking open by themselves. Then it escalated. Doors we knew were locked would open in the middle of the night. The shower would turn on by itself, sometimes the water scalding hot, sometimes icy cold. Things moved in the house, heavy objects sliding across shelves, drawers opening without cause. My sister suffered the worst of it. It started with her being pulled out of bed in the middle of the night. She'd wake up on the floor, terrified, not knowing how she got there. Then the shadows came. Dark figures at the edges of her room, flickering just outside her vision. And then came the rocks. Real physical stones began appearing inside the house, dropping out of nowhere, falling onto the floor in front of her, or even onto her bed while she slept. No explanation. No entry points. Just rocks, manifesting. My parents tried to downplay it at first, said it was stress, nightmares, maybe even a prank from one of us. But they couldn't deny what was happening. Even the neighbors started seeing things, strange figures around the house at night. One of them told us they saw someone standing by our window, watching. But when they walked closer, the figure vanished. My sister eventually refused to sleep in the house. She started staying at her gym late, showering there, avoiding being alone in her room. She never talked about it in detail, but I know it got worse than she let on. After 2 months, everything stopped, right around the time we lost the piece of stone. It vanished during the move, packed in a box that never made it to the new place, never seen again. And just like that, peace returned. But that trip changed us. And it taught me something simple, something I still believe to this day. When you find something strange in the wilderness, especially something tied to death or old ground, leave it alone. Don't take pieces. Don't disturb the silence. Because not all hauntings begin with a spirit. Sometimes they begin with your own curiosity. Story 74. The Frozen Lake and the Statue Beneath. There's something about hunting trips in the Arctic Circle that stays with you. Maybe it's the silence. The kind of silence that feels like it's pressing in on your ears. Or maybe it's the feeling that you're the only living thing out there for miles. I went out once to hunt reindeer. Just me, the snow, and a fire that barely stayed lit against the cold. That night, as I sat by the flames, I heard something moving out in the dark. Footsteps. But when I checked the ground the next morning, there weren't any tracks. Nothing fresh. Nothing disturbed. I chalked it up to nerves. The locals told stories, tales about old creatures in the snow, things older than people, older than language. They said trolls used to live in those mountains. I didn't believe them, but then I found it, half frozen in the middle of a lake, buried beneath ice thick enough to walk on, was a statue. Enormous, grotesque. Its shape was warped and twisted, like something pulled from a dream you try to forget. Tentacles, wings, a face that looked both human and not. It reminded me of those old drawings, Cthulhu, or something close to it. I don't know how it got there. I don't know who made it, but it wasn't a carving someone left behind for fun. It was heavy, too heavy to have been placed there by hand. We eventually had to use a crane to pull it out, and even then, I don't think we should have. Some things are meant to stay buried. And some statues are more than just stone. Story 75. The Hanging Cow on the Hill. It was supposed to be just another hike, me, a friend, and his parents. We were climbing a hill in Milton, West Virginia. A quiet place, peaceful even. From the streets below, you could see a small shack sitting at the top. We didn't think much of it, just a structure in a clearing. But when we got to the top, something was off. Hanging from one of the trees near the shack was a cow, a full-grown cow, suspended by its hind legs. It hadn't been gutted or processed, just hanging there, swaying slightly in the breeze. No marks around the tree, no tire tracks, no sign of how it got up there or who had done it. It wasn't the kind of thing you expect to find, even in the backwoods, even in West Virginia. The air felt strange up there, thicker, heavier. We left not long after. No one really said much on the way back down the hill. Some images you just carry with you, even if you never understand what they meant. Story 76. The camp that shouldn't be there. There's a scout camp deep in the mountains, a place called Mil Potrero, rented out from the Forest Service. It's not on most maps. You have to know where you're going to find it. We were sent there to clear it out, make it usable again. It had been abandoned for years and the place was overgrown, full of trash and old gear left behind. But as we went from cabin to cabin, we realized this wasn't just any old campsite. One of the cabins was covered, completely covered, in psychedelic murals, mushrooms, eyes, strange symbols painted all over the walls. Every surface was layered in color and chaos. In another cabin I found something else, a bong ornate, carved with intricate patterns, probably expensive, just left behind, like a forgotten relic of some strange party that happened long before we ever got there. And then we found the horror cabin. That one was different. It was still splattered, floor to ceiling with what looked like dried blood. We thought it was a prank at first, some elaborate setup. But then we found out the truth. Years ago, a low-budget horror movie had been filmed in that cabin. One of those cheesy B-movies with more fake blood than plot. But the blood, they hadn't cleaned it. Gallons of fake blood had dried into the walls, soaked into the floorboards, leaving behind the echo of something awful, even if it was just movie magic. We stayed the night anyway, but none of us slept well. Story 77. The fresh grave in the wilderness. Some places feel forgotten, but others feel like someone's still watching over them. We were out riding ATVs through the back trails of rural Alberta, not far from a gravel road when we found it. A small graveyard, a children's graveyard. There weren't many markers, just a fenced-in area, tucked under the trees, like it had been hidden there on purpose. But what caught our attention was the coffin. It was sealed, sitting above ground, small enough that you knew instantly it belonged to a child. Nearby was a single grave, freshly dug. The sod was still vibrant and damp, the earth unsettled. The marker read, Valk Mar Belak, 1913, 1916. Barely 3 years old, and yet, the grave looked brand new. The headstone was clean, the fence freshly painted. The ground still looked like it had been tended that very week. Who was keeping it that way? We later learned that the town nearby had once suffered a rash of children's deaths, a sickness that tore through the community decades ago. But the way that grave was maintained, someone hadn't let go. Someone was still coming back, to a place that the world had long forgotten. Story 78. The cage in the forest. It was a Boy Scout trip, nothing special, just a group hike through the woods in Washington state. We were out there for the usual camping drills, trail building, cooking lessons, just part of the program. But then we found it. A cage, big, rusted, hidden beneath some brush, tucked between 2 old pine trees. It wasn't for animals. It was too tall, too narrow, built more like a holding pen for something human. We didn't know what to say. The younger kids didn't want to go near it. Even the adults were thrown off. It wasn't just the structure, it was the feeling, that strange oppressive air that hangs around places that shouldn't be there. We didn't find any signs or markings, no notes, no tools, no trace of who built it or why. But something about it felt wrong, like it hadn't been built to keep something in, but to keep something out. Story 79. The sculpture in the dirt. Sometimes the creepiest things aren't the ones that move. They're the ones that sit perfectly still. I was hiking through a remote part of New Mexico, following a dirt trail that barely existed anymore, when I spotted something half buried in the ground. A sculpture. It was carved human-like, but distorted. Smooth in some places, jagged in others, like whoever made it wasn't trying to replicate anything exact, just a feeling. Its face had no expression, just hollow eyes, and a mouth that was more of a void than a smile. There was no sign of anyone else out there. No footprints, no vehicle tracks, no old campfire ash, just that sculpture, sitting in the dust, waiting. I didn't keep it, didn't take it home, but a friend of mine did. Said it gave him chills, but he wanted it anyway. He bought it off me for $50. I haven't asked him about it since. Story 80. The Forest Cellar in Indiana. Indiana has a way of hiding things. The trees grow thick, the ground rolls uneven, and sometimes you find things you're not supposed to. I was hiking alone, nothing serious, just following a trail that faded into brush when I found it. Out in the middle of nowhere. No house, no foundation, just a sunken doorway leading into the ground. The wooden doors were weathered, half covered in moss, and one side was already cracked open. Inside, it was just shadows. Cold, damp air and the smell of soil and rust. I didn't go far in, just a few steps, but there were remnants of something. Broken jars, old shelves, some kind of wire mesh along the walls. It felt more like a bunker than a root cellar. And the silence inside, it wasn't empty. It was thick, like the cellar itself was holding its breath. I didn't stay long, and I haven't been back since. Story 81. The Forgotten Church in El Paso. El Paso has its own kind of desert decay. Structures worn away by time, hidden just beyond the main roads. That's where I found the ruins. An old church, mostly collapsed, with just a few standing walls and pieces of brick still clinging to the landscape. It wasn't much to look at from a distance, but the closer I got, the stranger it felt. There were graves near the building, only a couple, but clearly marked. The headstones were weathered, worn smooth by sand and time. One of them was still standing upright, alone in the shadow of the crumbling structure. There was no path, no sign of recent visitors. Just a place forgotten by time, sitting silent in the desert heat. Places like that don't need ghosts to feel haunted. The silence does all the work for them. Story 82. The Vanishing Cemetery, and the Ghost in the Film. There was an old cemetery on the wrong side of my hometown, a place barely anyone remembered, tucked deep in the woods and slowly being taken over by the swamp. Most of the headstones were from the early 1900s. Some even older. Many were overturned or broken, some sunken completely into the mud. A friend and I used to visit, just to look around, clean up a little when we could. But we didn't talk about it much. It wasn't the kind of place you bragged about visiting. One day I brought my old 35mm camera to take photos. I dropped it while changing rolls, but managed to catch it before it hit the ground. Didn't think anything of it at the time. Later, when I developed the film, there were two photos that didn't make sense. One was a double exposure of the same grave. One image vertical, one horizontal, overlapping in a way that made it look wrong, unnatural. The second showed my friend standing in front of a tree, but his body was faint, blurred as if he wasn't really there, like he'd been caught mid-fade. The negatives were clean, no tears, no camera malfunction. Just those two strange photos. I've used that camera for years. That's the only time it ever did that. And the last time I went back to find that cemetery, I couldn't. It was gone. Maybe the swamp finally swallowed it. Maybe someone built over it. Or maybe it was never meant to be found again. Story 83. The Woman in the Trees and the Soldiers Behind Her. It happened while I was sitting in a tree stand, quiet, still, watching the woods like always. Then she came running. A woman, Mexican, from what I could tell, sprinting through the trees, looking terrified. She didn't even see me. She was too focused on whatever was behind her. And then they came. A group of soldiers, full gear, moving fast, like they were tracking her. They didn't see me either. Passed right under my stand, and disappeared into the woods. No one ever explained it. No news report, no follow-up. Nothing. Just one woman running for her life, and soldiers chasing shadows through the trees. Story 84. The Voice in the Tree. There was a dead tree behind our house, huge, hollowed out, its roots torn from the ground years ago, but the top of it was still tangled up in the canopy, lodged between the branches of the surrounding trees like some skeletal bridge. I used to climb it, higher and higher, just to see how far I could go before it started to feel unsafe. One day it was overcast, misty, dark. I remember that clearly. I was up there, halfway to the top, when I heard someone call my name. It was a man's voice. Thing is, I lived alone with my mother. I didn't even know my father. And there was no reason anyone should have been out in those woods, let alone someone who knew my name. I looked around, trying to find the source of the voice, but I couldn't see anyone. Then I heard it again, closer this time. He told me to stop being scared, said I should lean over the tree so I could see his face. I didn't move. Something in his voice didn't feel right. He kept saying I'd be very interested if I saw him, that I'd really want to see his face. Then his tone changed. He got upset, told me if I didn't jump out of the tree right then. If I didn't jump, he was going to climb up and get me himself. I was crying by that point, frozen. And then, thank God, my mom came out into the yard and called for me. That was enough to snap me out of it. I never heard the voice again, but I still think about what might have happened if I had leaned over, if I had seen whatever was waiting beneath the branches. Story 85. The Bone-Burying Man in a Suit. I was walking through the woods one day, just exploring, nothing special, when I saw him. A man, middle of the forest, dressed in a full suit. He didn't see me. I stayed hidden behind the trees. He was burying something. At first I couldn't tell what it was, but then I saw the bones. He was holding them the way someone would carry a child, cradled in his arms. And he wasn't just tossing them in the dirt. He was methodical about it, quiet, focused. It was eerie, seeing someone so well dressed, doing something so strange, so far from civilization. I never approached. I never spoke a word. I just turned around and left as quietly as I could. And I've never been able to shake the image of that man in the suit, burying bones in the middle of nowhere. Story 86. The Biker in the Swamp. It wasn't exactly deep in the woods. It was a paved road running alongside a dense tree line. I was walking with my dad, my sister, his girlfriend, maybe even her kid. I don't remember why we were there, or where we were going, just that we were all together on that road. There was a bulldozer parked nearby, maybe a construction site, maybe a campsite. Hard to say now. We were just walking along when we came to a small break in the trees. A narrow opening, like a window into the woods. There were a few branches in the way, but you could still see in, and there it was. A pond, small, dark, still, and floating in the middle of it was a body, face down, dressed in a yellow shirt and jeans. The bike was in the water too, half submerged. The man still had his helmet on, but his skin was bloated and purple. Nobody said a word. We just kept walking, like we hadn't seen anything at all. It wasn't reported. Not by us. Not by anyone else, as far as I know. I've thought about that day so many times over the years. What kind of person sees something like that, and says nothing? Maybe I was too young to understand the weight of it all. Maybe the adults thought it wasn't our problem. I don't know. But that image, that body in the pond, has never left my mind. Story 87. The Tree of Dog Skulls. We were just a bunch of teens messing around in the woods when we found it. A dog skull, nailed to a tree. We thought it was creepy, sure, but also kind of funny in a messed up way. We figured it'd be a good spot to get high, so we lit up and stayed there most of the afternoon. Hours passed. The sun started going down. I decided to climb the tree, just to see how high I could get. When I got up near the top, I noticed something strange. There was a hollow section near one of the thick branches. I peeked inside, and saw bones. More dog bones than I could count. Skulls, limbs, all crammed into the hollow of the tree. I looked up, and that's when I realized there were more skulls. Higher up, nailed to branches way beyond where I thought anyone could climb. We kept going back to that tree, after that. There was something hypnotic about it. Something off. The last time we went, my friend swore there was a new skull. I didn't believe him at first, but then I saw it. It looked fresh, whiter than the others. And the nail? Shiny, untarnished, new. That tree was changing. Someone was still adding to it. And whoever they were still out there. Story 88. The Spider Made of Human Arms. It happened while I was out on the porch with my uncle. We were just relaxing, having a smoke together at his cabin. The forest stretched out in front of us, quiet, calm. Then it came down the tree. A spider. But not like any spider we'd ever seen. This thing was made of human arms. That's the only way I can describe it. Dozens of arms, bending and moving like legs, all connected in this impossible shape. It scuttled down the bark like something out of a nightmare. We both saw it. My uncle and I. He still remembers it to this day. I don't know what we saw. I don't even try to explain it anymore. Some things just aren't meant to be understood. Story 89. The tombstone that led me out. We were supposed to be hiking just a casual walk in the woods to find a rock that looked like a mushroom. That's all. My friend invited me out. Said she knew where it was. Turns out, she didn't. We wandered deeper and deeper, further than we should have. Eventually it became clear we were lost. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. That's when she left me. No warning, no goodbye. Just turned and walked off somewhere else in the forest, like it wasn't a big deal. I was alone, running through the trees, trying to get my bearings, trying to find something familiar. That's when I saw it. A figure in the distance. Small, dark. Just standing there. I thought maybe it was another person. Maybe even someone who could help. So I ran toward it, yelling, relieved for the first time in hours. But the closer I got, the more it moved away. Always just ahead, never getting closer. Finally I reached it, and it wasn't a person at all. It was one of those roadside memorials. Those little markers people put up, where someone died in a car accident. A small tombstone, weathered by time. It was just standing there, in the woods. But beyond it, through the trees, I saw a road. It had led me out. Story 90. The Huts and the Dead Fish. It was a river hike. Just me, my dad and my younger sister. The floodplain ran along the edge, wide and empty. That's where we saw them. Huts, 3 or 4 of them, scattered across the area like some forgotten campsite. Built from sticks and brush, makeshift walls, patchwork roofs, primitive and silent. We poked our heads into a few. Most were empty, just dirt floors, and old debris. But one of them, had something inside. A statue. It was Joseph, Jesus' father, standing upright in the center of the hut. And next to him, a fish, dead, half-rotted, a single massive bite taken out of its stomach. That was it. No tools, no signs of recent activity. Just a religious statue, and a mutilated fish, laid out like some kind of offering. We never figured out who built those huts, or why. But I've never forgotten that bite mark. Story 91. The echoing scream in the forest. We were just a couple of kids, maybe 15, exploring the woods near my friend's new house in the Irish countryside. His place was right on the edge of a massive forest, dark, overgrown, and way too quiet. We thought it would be fun to go in before sunset, see how deep we could get before it got creepy. Didn't take long. The deeper we walked, the more oppressive it felt. The silence wasn't natural. It was heavy, almost like the woods were holding their breath. And then we heard it. A sound, distant but unmistakable, echoing through the trees. It was this strange drawn-out wail, like nothing I'd ever heard before. High-pitched and hollow, like it was bouncing between the trunks. We froze. Neither of us said a word. We just bolted. Built a makeshift shelter out of fear, more than anything else. Just trying to put something between us and that sound. That was the first time either of us had ever heard something like that out there. And the last time we went in after dark. Story 92. The Deer Grave and the Bloody Antler. We were just out in the woods behind my house, me and a friend. We were around 15 at the time, just out exploring like we always did. That's when we found it. A deer antler, just lying there in the grass, covered in dried blood. We didn't say anything at first, just looked at each other, trying to process it. But then a few minutes later, we found the rest of it. A massive hole in the ground, dug out like a grave. And inside it, a full deer skeleton, every bone in place, laid out perfectly. The whole thing soaked in blood that had already dried into the soil. And around the grave, shovels, crosses. It looked like some kind of ritual, like a burial ceremony meant for something more than just a deer. My friend kept the antler, still has it to this day. But I've never stopped wondering what really happened there. And who went to all that trouble to bury a deer like that. Story 93. The warm deer leg in the barn. I was 8 years old, just a kid from a rural community. That weekend, some friends and I decided to go exploring in the woods near town. We stumbled across an old barn, run down, forgotten. The kind of place you'd expect to be empty for decades. Its roof was sagging, the walls barely holding together. We went inside, curious. There wasn't much at first, just old boxes, broken tools, scattered junk. We poked around, laughing, daring each other to go deeper, and then we found it. On the far side of the barn, propped upright on a stick, was a deer leg, just one. Impaled. One of my friends reached out and touched it, maybe just trying to be brave. He jumped back immediately. Said it was warm. Not just warm from the sun. Warm like it had just been there, like it had just happened. We didn't stick around to figure out who or what left it like that. We ran. Story 94. The gun in the bluebells. I was just a kid, maybe 8 years old, when I wandered into the woods near my grandmother's place. It was one of those calm country walks where nothing really seems threatening. The forest was full of bluebells, bright and soft beneath the trees. That's when I saw it. Something glinting in the dirt. I knelt down and brushed away the soil, and there it was. A gun. I didn't know if it was real or fake, loaded or empty, but it sure looked real enough to me. And this was in England, where finding something like that isn't exactly normal. I stood there, staring at it, a weird chill creeping up my spine, and then I saw the sheep. A little farther in, lying in the bluebells, was the body of a sheep, half decayed. Its head was rotted down to the bone, but the rest of its body was strangely intact. There wasn't a sheep farm anywhere nearby, nothing that explained how it got there, or why. Something about the whole scene just felt wrong. I left the woods that day with a knot in my stomach, and ever since I've never felt comfortable walking in the woods alone. Story 95. The Satanic Clearing. I was about 15 at the time, just a teenage girl spending the day with my boyfriend. We lived in Iceland, and like most kids our age, we decided to wander into the woods together. No real plan, just walking, talking, enjoying the quiet. Eventually we came to a clearing and sat down. Things started to get a little intimate. We were alone, surrounded by trees, and the moment just kind of took over. But right at the peak of that moment, we heard something. Movement in the bushes. Someone or something was watching us. We jumped up in a panic. My boyfriend scrambled to pull his pants up, and we ran. Neither of us had any idea where we were going. We just ran deeper into the forest, away from whatever had been out there. That's when we came to another clearing, and this one was worse. Goats. Sheep. Dead and hanging from the trees. Blood everywhere. Pentagrams drawn on the trunks surrounding the space, every single tree marked. It was like we'd stumbled into the middle of a ritual site. some kind of dark ceremony, half finished, still echoing with whatever had taken place there. We didn't stop, we didn't look back, we just kept running until we found our way out. We still talk about it sometimes, now as a joke, like some surreal memory from our youth. But deep down, I know we were lucky, because whatever was in that forest that day, watching us, it didn't want us to stay. Story 96. The bag of bloody children's clothes I used to spend time near the old railroad tracks that ran through the woods by my house. The area was quiet, mostly forgotten, just overgrown paths and a few scattered signs of life from the past. One day, while exploring one of the deeper areas, I found what looked like an old hobo camp, burnt furniture, trash, broken bottles, and then I saw it, a garbage bag. I opened it without thinking, just out of curiosity. Inside were children's clothes, covered in blood. I didn't touch anything after that, didn't dig further. I just stood there, staring, not sure what to do. I left that place behind me, and never went back. Sometimes I wonder who else knew it was there, and who never came back out of those woods. Story 97. The Pale Woman in the Woods. When I was a kid, I used to see her. She lived in the woods behind our house, or at least that's what I believed. I never saw her up close, never heard her speak, but I knew she was there. Pale, unnaturally pale, almost glowing. She would stand just beyond the tree line, watching. Still, there was something otherworldly about her, like a spirit, or something older than the forest itself. I was drawn to her, fascinated in a way I didn't fully understand at the time. I spent years trying to find her again, slipping into the trees, hoping for a glimpse, but she always stayed just out of reach. Looking back, I don't know if she was real, or just some strange creation of a child's imagination, but I still remember the way she looked, and how it felt to know something was watching from the woods. Story 98. The cave called the Delph. I grew up in a small village in England, called Iam, better known as the Plague Village. You can look it up if you want. It's the place where they voluntarily quarantined themselves during the Black Death to stop it from spreading. The whole area is surrounded by massive hills and thick forest, isolated, quiet. The kind of place where stories take root and never leave. One of those stories was about a place called the Delph. It was just outside the village, down an old overgrown trail most people didn't even remember. Locals said it was where they used to hold funeral services during the plague outbreaks, some kind of natural stone formation, like a cave. Growing up, we were terrified of it. We'd hear stories about ghostly vicars floating through the trees, about spirits that would follow you home if you stayed too long. During the day, though, we used to go out there, just to see it from a distance. Really. Sometimes we'd wander around the area nearby, pretending we were brave. Once we even found cow skulls on sticks scattered around the woods near it. Eventually, one of my friends, one of the bolder ones, suggested we go all the way in, so we did. There were 5 of us. We left around 4 in the afternoon, and brought a flashlight. Only 2 of us were willing to actually go inside the cave. Me and him. The others waited outside. The moment we stepped in, it was like the air changed. Cold, heavy, silent in a way that didn't feel natural. We reached the back of the cave. It wasn't very deep, but there was a narrow crack at the end, just wide enough to squeeze through. My friend went in first. I followed, flashlight in hand. Then he screamed, dropped the flashlight, tried to push past me in total darkness, panicked and crying. I didn't know what was happening. I just tried to get out of that crack before he trampled me. We scrambled back to the surface. The others were gone. They'd taken off and left us behind. We ran all the way home, didn't even stop to talk about what happened. The next day I asked him what he saw. He told me it was a face, white, smiling, pressed into the darkness of that narrow passage and moving toward him. He never went back there. None of us did. We still call it the Delph, and no one really knows what's waiting inside. Story 99. The Little Indian. It was a story my uncle told once, just one time, around a campfire at a party. He'd never mentioned it before, and never brought it up again. But when he told it, his voice changed, like it had stayed with him all these years. He grew up near a Native American reservation, about 50 years ago. When he was around 10 years old, he and a friend decided to play a prank on one of their classmates. They thought it would be funny to scare him out in the woods, so they picked a spot along a walking trail and hid behind a fallen log, waiting for the kid to come by. But he never did. Instead, something else came down the path. A figure small, maybe 3 or 4 feet tall. He described it as a little Indian, just walking slowly through the forest. When it reached the part of the trail closest to where they were hiding, it stopped. And it looked straight at them. Not just a glance, like it knew they were there the whole time. Like it had been expecting them. Then, without a word, it turned and kept walking. My uncle said they ran after that. Didn't speak a word. Didn't play the prank. Didn't even tell anyone about it, until that night around the fire. I remember the way he told it, slow, careful, almost like he was still trying to convince himself it had happened. But the way his voice shook at the end, that part felt real. Story 100. The Jersey Devil. There's an old myth that floats around the coastal regions of New England, passed down in whispers, like a half-forgotten tale that never really fades away. The story of the Jersey Devil. It goes back to colonial times. A poor couple, 12 children already, barely scraping by. When the wife realized she was pregnant again, she cursed it, said she hoped the next child would be a devil. And it was. They say it was a brutal birth, in the middle of a snowstorm. The baby came out twisted, its head shaped like a horse, full of sharp teeth and glowing red eyes. It had the torso of a man, the legs of a goat, a long serpent's tail, and massive bat-like wings. It didn't stay in the cradle for long. As the legend goes, it screeched, tore through the house, and vanished up the chimney, flying off into the storm. Over time, the stories got stranger. People claimed it grew larger, now the size of a horse, prowling dark roads at night. One woman even said it kept her and her son trapped in their house for days. She showed pictures afterward, cloven hoofprints stamped into the snow on the roof. Whether it's a myth or something more, people still talk about it, still hear things in the night, still glance over their shoulder when they're driving through the woods in New Jersey, just in case. Story 101. The Giant Fly and the Dream Sequence. It started with a nightmare. I was about 10 years old when I had it. A dream where this massive, disgusting fly kept following me. It wasn't buzzing around like a normal insect. It was chasing me, bumping into me, smearing me with filth. It was huge, about the size of a dog. Just big enough to be truly wrong. I woke up shaken, spent the rest of the night lying in bed, trying to forget about it. The next day was normal. School, homework, nothing out of the ordinary. But then I went into the bathroom during class. I was alone, washing my hands, when I noticed a few flies buzzing around to my right. Not a swarm, just a few. It seemed weird, but I shrugged it off and dried my hands. Later that day, I went out into the woods near my house, just like I always did. I wandered through the trees for a while, until I found them. 2 dead rabbits, fresh, still bleeding. It looked like they'd been cut open, deliberate clean wounds. And surrounding them was a cloud of flies. A thick swarm, crawling over their bodies. I backed away slowly, heart pounding. Some of the flies broke from the swarm and flew straight toward me. I swatted at them, then turned and ran. I don't even remember how far I went. I just kept running until I could see my house again. The buzzing was still in my ears, growing louder, closer. When I got home, I didn't say a word to my parents. Just went to my room and tried to forget it. But that night, I had another dream. I was standing in the woods again. Same trees, same stillness, and above me circling in the air was that same giant fly from before. It dove toward me, and I ran, just like in real life. But this time, I found something. A clearing, a fire pit, freshly stacked with wood. A wooden stake in the ground. The fly landed on the stake and stared at me. Then the fire pit ignited on its own, bright roaring flames, and the fly leapt into it. It started burning, its body twisted and charred, wings crackling in the heat. And that's when a man stepped out of the shadows. He was tall, silent, holding a long two-pronged fork. He stabbed the fly's burning body and lifted it out of the flames. Then bit into it. Didn't even flinch, just chewed and swallowed, like it was normal. Then he looked at me, and his shadow, cast by the fire, started growing, spreading across the clearing, stretching out until it covered everything. And then I woke up. The next day, I took a couple of friends out to the woods, tried to show them where I'd found the rabbits, but they were gone. No blood, no carcasses, no swarm of flies. We spent over an hour, searching. I even tried to find the clearing from my dream. There was nothing. But ever since that day, whenever I hear a fly buzzing near me, I flinch. My chest tightens. My mind goes straight back to that clearing, to the fire, and to the man in the shadows. Because somewhere, deep down, I still feel like it wasn't just a dream. Story 102. The laughing from the septic tank. I was 15 when it happened. My friend Catherine and I decided to go for a walk in the woods one night, just for the thrill of it, I guess. There was no reason, really. Just one of those impulsive teenage things. We didn't go too deep at first, just followed the paths, listened to the sounds of the night, letting the silence stretch between us. That's when we found it. A campsite, or something like one. It wasn't like anything official. There was a tiny, almost child-sized tent, set up near what looked like a septic tank. The lid was off, and the smell hit us right away. Thick, chemical, awful. We stepped closer, curious, trying to figure out what we were even looking at. There was trash scattered around, old footprints, and just this unsettling stillness in the air. Then we heard it. Laughter. Coming from inside the tank. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, echoing, almost playful. The kind of sound that cuts right through you, even when it's quiet. We froze. Just stood there for a second, trying to convince ourselves we'd imagined it. But we hadn't. We didn't wait around to find out who or what was in there. We turned and ran all the way home, hearts pounding, barely speaking a word. For a long time, we didn't even talk about it. It just became one of those memories we locked away, hoping it would fade. Years later, Catherine brought it up out of nowhere. "You remember the laughing from the septic tank?" she asked. I did. And the moment she said it, that feeling came rushing back. The smell, the dark, the sound of that voice rising from somewhere it never should have been. Some things in the woods aren't meant to be found. Out there in the woods, beyond the beaten paths and beneath the canopy where sunlight barely reaches, there are things most people will never see. Stories that echo between the trees. Moments that leave no explanation, only silence, and the lingering feeling that something was watching. Whether it's a voice calling from the branches, a clearing marked with symbols, or something impossible moving just beyond the edge of sight. These stories remind us that the forest keeps its secrets well, and maybe that's the way it's meant to be. But here we bring those secrets to light. If you've ever seen something out there, something strange, something you've never been able to explain, share it in the comments. We read every one, and if you want to keep exploring the strange, the forgotten, and the hidden, subscribe to From the Depths of the Board. There's more waiting. Much more. We'll see you in the next one.